What could a quiet ranch cook possibly know that a frontier doctor was desperate to keep alive? The bunkhouse shutters slammed in the gale as Grace lifted another spoonful of steaming broth to Eli's cracked lips. Jacob's fists tightened beside the cot. "It's only soup." Dr. Hayes spun toward the giant cowboy, his voice cutting through the coughing. "Then you'd better understand what that soup is doing." What did he know that Jacob didn't? Stay with us and discover why. The wind had been striking Pine Hollow Ranch since before sundown, hard enough to make the bunkhouse shutters jump against their iron hooks. Snow pushed beneath the door in thin white lines. The chimney drew badly whenever the gusts turned north, and smoke sometimes rolled back into the room before the draft caught again. Along both walls, ranch hands lay under quilts and horse blankets, some sweating through their shirts, others shaking so hard the bed frames clicked against the floorboards. Dr. Walter Hayes moved between them with his sleeves rolled past his elbows. He had been awake almost 2 days. His gray hair stood crooked where he had shoved his fingers through it, and a brown medicine case sat open on the table beside bottles, folded cloth, a thermometer, and 3 chipped coffee mugs nobody remembered filling. "Easy," Walter murmured as one of the men coughed into a handkerchief. "Don't fight for a deep breath. Just take the next one." At the far end of the room, Grace Miller sat beside the stove. The heat had turned her cheeks pink, but the rest of her looked worn down to stubbornness. Her dark wool dress was creased from hours of sitting, rising, bending, carrying, and sitting again. Loose strands of brown hair clung to her temples. Her apron bore stains from broth, lamp soot, and spilled water. Beside her chair stood a battered black stockpot. Steam curled from beneath the lid. Grace lifted it, stirred slowly with a wooden spoon, then replaced it before reaching for the smaller bowl in her lap. 8-year-old Eli Dawson lay on a narrow cot, pulled close to the stove. His face looked too small against the pillow. Grace slipped one arm behind his shoulders and raised him barely an inch. "Just one," she whispered. Eli's eyelids fluttered. "I don't want it." "I know." His voice scraped like paper. Grace blew across the spoon. "You don't have to want it." She touched the spoon to his mouth. "Just swallow this one for me." Eli obeyed. Grace waited, counted beneath her breath, then gave him another. Across the room, Jacob Dawson stood with his back against a support post. Even in the crowded bunkhouse, he seemed too large for the place. At 6'7", he had spent most of his life ducking beneath door frames and folding himself into chairs built for ordinary men. Tonight, he looked larger still beneath his heavy work shirt, though the exhaustion in his face made that size feel useless. His coat hung from a nail near the door, crusted with melting snow. His hair was damp. His eyes were red from wind, sleeplessness, or both. For the better part of an hour, he had said almost nothing. He carried water when Grace asked. He split kindling when the stove ran low. He held a lantern while Walter examined one of the ranch hands. But every few minutes, his gaze returned to Eli. And every time Grace raised another spoon, Jacob's jaw tightened. Eli swallowed again. Grace eased him back onto the pillow and wiped the corner of his mouth with a clean cloth. "That's enough for now." Jacob pushed away from the post. "How much has he had?" "About half a cup since dark. That's all?" Grace looked up. "It's what he can keep down." Jacob glanced toward the pot. The room smelled of beef bones, onion, barley, and wood smoke. The scent had settled into the blankets and the walls until the entire bunkhouse seemed to breathe it. Walter crossed behind them carrying a basin. Jacob lowered his voice. "He needs more than this." Grace's hand stopped on the cloth. "He'll get more when his stomach lets him." Jacob rubbed both hands over his face. 3 men groaned from the far wall. Someone coughed hard enough to shake his cot. Jacob looked at the stockpot again. For 3 days, he said. It's been broth. Broth in the morning, broth at noon, broth after dark. Grace's eyes returned to Eli. Yes. Nothing but broth. Walter stopped. Not gradually. One moment he was walking toward the table. The next he was perfectly still. He turned. What did you say? Jacob looked at him. I said they need something stronger. Walter set the basin down with a hard little knock. You think I haven't tried? I didn't say that. Then don't stand there and talk as if a plate of beef and potatoes is what separates these men from getting well. Jacob's shoulders squared. I'm asking a question. No. Walter pointed toward the nearest cot. You're frightened, and you're looking for something you can order fixed. The room seemed to shrink. Grace did not move. Jacob's expression hardened, but he said nothing. Walter stepped closer. That man over there couldn't keep water in him yesterday. Grace got 6 spoonfuls into him every hour until midnight. He pointed toward another bed. Tom Reeves vomited everything I gave him until she started feeding him a mouthful at a time and waiting. Then he looked toward Eli. And your boy has taken more liquid tonight than he managed all day yesterday. Jacob's gaze dropped to the child. Walter's voice lowered. I can treat a fever. I can listen to lungs. I can set a broken bone and stitch a cut. But medicine means precious little when a man is too weak to drink and too sick to eat. He gestured toward the black pot. That broth carries water, salt, and enough nourishment to keep something in them. And she has sat here hour after hour making sure they take it. Jacob looked at Grace. She was not looking at him. Walter continued. I'm not telling you soup is curing anything. I'm telling you several men in this room are still strong enough for their bodies to fight, because she refused to let them dry out, while the rest of us were busy worrying over bottles and powders. The wind slammed against the wall. A shutter banged once. Nobody spoke. Then Walter said, quieter now. Call it nothing special if you like, Dawson. It's helping keep them alive long enough for me to do my part. Something changed in Jacob's face. Grace saw it without turning fully toward him. A stillness. A recognition. Perhaps even shame. Nothing special. The words had been spoken before. Weeks before. Across a long supper table when snow had only begun touching the high country, and Grace Miller had still been little more than the new cook with a daughter and a trunk upstairs. Jacob remembered the bowl in front of him. Beef stew, hot biscuits, stewed apples. He remembered Grace standing near the end of the table, waiting for an answer she had tried to pretend did not matter. He remembered himself wiping his mouth and saying, with all the careless certainty of a man who thought honesty excused clumsiness, it's good. Nothing special, but good. He had forgotten the moment almost as soon as it passed. She had not. Now Grace shifted closer to Eli. The boy stirred. Aunt Grace? Her face softened at once. I'm here. Jacob's eyes closed briefly. Eli had never called her that before. Grace dipped the spoon again. Steam drifted across her face. Try one more. Eli swallowed. His small hand moved weakly across the blanket until his fingers found the edge of her apron. Grace left them there. Walter returned to his patience. The bunkhouse settled back into its miserable rhythm, coughing, stove crackle, footsteps, the occasional clink of glass. Jacob remained where he was. Grace reached for the cloth, wiped Eli's mouth, then pressed the back of her fingers gently to his forehead. Jacob watched her. Not the stockpot. Not the medicine. Her. He noticed how carefully she shifted her weight so the cot would not creak beneath her, how she rubbed warmth back into Eli's cold fingers before taking the next spoon, how she checked the marks she had made beside his name on a scrap of brown paper pinned near the bed. Time. Water, broth. Fever. Every little thing counted. Jacob moved closer. Grace heard his boots but did not look up. After a moment, he said, "Grace." She lifted another spoon. "What?" His mouth opened. Nothing came. For a man who could order 20 cowboys through a blizzard, face down a charging steer, or haul a fence post from frozen ground with his own hands, words suddenly seemed beyond him. Grace waited only a second. Then she turned back to Eli. "Hold the lamp higher," she said. Jacob reached for it immediately. He lifted the lantern over her shoulder. Its light spread across Grace's hands, Eli's pale face, and the slow curl of steam rising from the spoon. Outside, the storm buried the road to Red Creek deeper by the minute. Inside, Jacob Dawson stood beside the woman whose cooking he had once called nothing special and watched her keep the people he loved alive one spoonful at a time. And for the first time, he understood that he had been looking at the wrong thing. 6 weeks earlier, Grace Miller had arrived in Red Creek with one trunk, one daughter, and $7 folded into the inside pocket of her coat. The stage left them in front of Parker's General Store just after noon. Snow had fallen the night before, but wagon wheels had already ground most of it into brown slush along Main Street. Horses stood tied to hitching rails beneath wool blankets. Smoke leaned sideways from stovepipes in the wind. Somewhere farther down the road, a blacksmith's hammer rang against iron in a slow, steady rhythm. Molly Miller climbed down first. At 11, she had already learned how to look at a new place without appearing impressed by it. "Is this it?" she asked. Grace stepped down carefully, one gloved hand gripping the stage rail. "This is it." Red Creek was smaller than the town Grace had pictured from the letter. One hotel, a livery stable, a church with a crooked white steeple, 2 saloons, a feed store, a small brick building with a sign for Dr. Walter Hayes. Parker's General Store stood near the center of town, its windows fogged from the stove inside. Grace turned toward the driver. "My trunk, please." He dragged it from the rear rack and dropped it into the slush with less care than she liked. Grace stared at him. The man stared back. Then he sighed, lifted it again, and set it properly on the boardwalk. "Thank you," Grace said. Molly hid a smile. Grace had dressed carefully for their arrival. Her dark brown wool dress was plain but well mended. Her coat pulled snug across her broad figure, and she had pinned her chestnut hair under a modest felt hat that had once belonged to her older sister. She knew people looked. They always had. Some looked because she was a widow traveling alone with a child. Some looked because she was new. Others looked because Grace Miller was a large woman in a world that rarely allowed women her size to move through a room without offering some silent opinion. She had stopped answering those opinions years ago. Most of them were not worth the breath. Inside the store, heat struck them immediately. The place smelled of coffee beans, leather, kerosene, dried apples, and the iron stove glowing near the rear wall. A woman in her late 40s looked up from behind the counter. "Mrs. Miller?" Grace loosened her scarf. "Yes." The woman came around the counter, wiping her hands on her apron. "Helen Parker." Her handshake was firm. "I'm glad you made it before the next storm." "So am I." Helen glanced toward Molly. "And this must be your girl." "Molly." Molly nodded politely. Helen's smile warmed. "Well, I've got bad news before I've got good." Grace's fingers tightened around the handle of her carpetbag. She already knew from Helen's face which kind would come first. "The boarding house job is gone." For a moment, Grace heard nothing but the stove ticking behind her. The letter said they were holding it until Thursday. I know. It is Thursday. I know that too. Helen looked genuinely sorry. Mrs. Daniels hired her niece 3 days ago. Girl came in from Bozeman after her husband left her. Family matter. Grace looked toward the front window. Outside, a freight wagon passed through the slush. Molly said nothing. She never did when she thought her mother might need every bit of dignity available. Grace turned back. Did Mrs. Daniels leave a message? Helen hesitated. No. That answered more than a message would have. Grace nodded once. All right. You can stay upstairs here for a few nights, Helen said. There's a room over the storeroom. I'll pay for it. I wasn't asking. I know. Helen studied her, then gave the smallest smile. 2 bits a night. Grace knew it was less than the hotel. She also knew enough not to insult kindness when it came dressed as business. Done. By evening, Grace had unpacked exactly half the trunk. That was all she allowed herself. Molly sat on the narrow bed beneath the attic window, knees drawn up beneath her skirt. What happens now? Grace folded a blouse. Now I find work. What if there isn't any? Grace laid the blouse into the drawer. There's always work. That isn't what I asked. Grace looked at her daughter. Molly had her father's dark eyes, steady eyes. William had looked at Grace that same way whenever she tried pretending hard things were smaller than they were. Grace sat beside her. We have enough for a little while. How little? Enough. Molly waited. Grace sighed. A week if we're careful. Molly looked toward the trunk. We could sell the recipe book. No. You said it might be worth something. I also said your grandmother wrote half those pages. Grace touched Molly's knee. We are not selling memories before we've sold biscuits. That earned a small smile. The following morning, Grace asked Helen whether she could use the old cook stove in the rear storeroom. By noon, the smell of biscuits had found its way through the entire store. By 1, 3 freight drivers had bought them. By 2, Helen had cleared a section of the back counter. The next morning, Grace added meat pies, then stew. She wrote prices on a square of brown paper and pinned it beside the coffee grinder. Biscuits, 2 cents. Meat pie, 8 cents stew and bread. 10 cents coffee came with the meal if the customer brought his own cup. Red Creek noticed. Men who had never seen Grace before began coming through the rear door around noon. Some were polite. Some were hungry enough not to bother. A few enjoyed the sound of themselves. One miner bit into a biscuit and groaned. Lord above, Mrs. Miller. A woman cooks like this. She's bound to keep herself well fed. 2 men laughed. Grace continued ladling stew. 10 cents. The miner blinked. For the stew? For the stew. She held out her hand. He gave her a dime. Molly, washing cups behind the curtain, had heard every word. That evening she dried a plate harder than necessary. I hate them. Grace looked over. Who? You know who. Grace rolled dough with both palms. They paid. That doesn't make it right. No. Then why don't you say something? Grace dusted flour from her fingers. Because some men want an argument almost as much as they want supper. Molly frowned. And I'm not feeding both. Molly tried not to smile. Failed. Still, Grace noticed the girl watching her more carefully after that, especially in the quiet hour after customers left. Grace never ate while the room was full. She told Molly it was because she preferred waiting until the work was done. That was partly true. The rest was nobody's business. 4 days passed. Grace earned enough to pay Helen for the upstairs room and still put coins into a small tin tucked beneath her stockings. Not much, but something. Then, on Monday afternoon, while snow began falling again beyond the front windows, the bell above Parker's door gave a hard little jangle. Helen looked up. So did half the store. The man who entered had to duck. Not slightly, completely. He bent beneath the frame, stepped inside, then straightened until he seemed to take up far more of the room than one man reasonably should. Molly stopped carrying a stack of tin plates. Grace looked over from the stove. The stranger was enormous, at least 6.5 feet tall, broad through the shoulders, heavy winter coat, dark hat dusted with snow. He had the weathered look of a man who spent more time beneath open sky than under a roof. His face was not handsome in the polished wink some men worked hard to become. It was strong, quiet, marked by wind and sun. Helen called from the counter. "Afternoon, Jacob." The giant removed his hat. "Mrs. Parker?" His voice was deep, but not loud. Grace returned to stirring the pot. A few minutes later, she realized he was standing near her table. "Mrs. Miller?" She looked up. Up farther, then farther still. "Yes?" "Jacob Dawson." He held his hat against one thigh. "I own Pine Hollow Ranch north of here. I've heard the name." His eyes shifted toward the stove. "I've heard yours. That happened quickly." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "I need a cook." Grace wiped her hands on her apron. "For how long?" "Until spring, maybe longer." "How many mouths?" 18 ranch hands when everyone's in. "Me. 2 boys. Your sons?" "Nephews." Grace nodded. "What happened to your last cook?" "Broke his leg falling off a loading platform. His sister took him to Helena." "How far is the ranch?" "Little over 12 miles by the North Road. Longer if snow closes Tanner Pass." "What are you paying?" He named a figure. Grace did not show surprise. It was better than the boarding house. Much better. "And my daughter?" Jacob glanced toward Molly, who was making no effort whatsoever to appear as though she wasn't listening. "She comes with you." "Where does she sleep?" "There's a room beside yours." "School?" "Red Creek when the road allows. Otherwise there are books at the ranch." Grace folded her arms. "What condition is the kitchen in?" Jacob paused. "Usable." "That answer worries me." This time the corner of his mouth definitely moved. "There's a cook stove, 2 work tables, pantry. Pump freezes when it gets too cold, so sometimes water comes from the well. Do you expect your cook to scrub bunkhouse floors? No. Wash 18 men's clothes? No. Mend shirts? No." Grace held his gaze. "What exactly do you expect?" Jacob answered without hesitation. "Feed the ranch." She waited. Nothing else came. "That's all?" "I asked for a cook, Mrs. Miller, not a servant." Something inside Grace went still. Not soft. Not yet. Just still. Most men who hired women without husbands seemed to assume the arrangement purchased every spare hour in their bodies. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, mending, nursing, gratitude. Jacob Dawson appeared to be buying one thing and naming it plainly. Grace looked toward Molly. Her daughter raised one eyebrow. William used to do that. Grace hated when she did it now. "I'll think about it tonight," Grace said. Jacob nodded. "Fair enough. No pressure. No speech." He put his hat back on. "I leave for Pine Hollow Wednesday morning. If you want the position, be here by 7. Then he turned and walked toward the door. Grace called after him. Mr. Dawson. He looked back. Why me? Jacob glanced once toward the empty stew pot, then toward the 3 ranch hands at the rear table scraping the last gravy from their plates with biscuit crust. You feed people. Grace waited. He added, and they come back. Then he ducked beneath the doorway and disappeared into the snow. Molly was beside Grace before the bell stopped moving. He is the largest person I've ever seen. Thank you for that useful observation. Do you think he has to order special beds? Grace gave her a look. I'm serious. I know. That is the problem. 2 mornings later, their trunk was tied behind Jacob Dawson's wagon. Helen handed Grace a small paper sack for the road. Biscuits. You're going to make me pay for those? Absolutely not. Grace hugged her. Helen held on for an extra second, then whispered, Come back if you need to. Grace nodded. She could not trust her voice. Molly climbed beneath the wagon blanket. Grace stepped onto the wheel hub. A large hand appeared beside her. Jacob did not grab her, did not assume. He simply held it there. Grace looked at the hand, then at him. After a moment, she placed hers in it. His fingers closed carefully. He helped her onto the seat, as though her size required no comment and no special handling at all. That alone unsettled her more than she cared to admit. Jacob clicked his tongue at the horses. The wagon rolled north. Behind them, Red Creek disappeared beneath a curtain of fine white snow. Ahead, the road narrowed between dark pines and climbed toward a ranch Grace had never seen. Molly tucked the blanket beneath her chin. Grace held the flour-stained recipe book in her lap and watched the mountains grow larger. She had accepted work. Nothing more. At least that was what she told herself when Jacob quietly shifted the lap blanket farther across her knees because the wind had changed. The road to Pine Hollow climbed steadily after Red Creek disappeared behind them. By mid-morning, the wagon had left the wider freight road and turned onto a narrower track cut between stands of lodgepole pine. Snow sat heavy on the branches. Every few minutes, a clump dropped with a soft thud into the drifts below. Jacob drove without wasting words. He seemed to know every rut beneath the snow. At one steep bend, he stood slightly on the brake while the horses picked their way over frozen ground. Grace caught the side of the wagon seat when one wheel slid. Jacob's arm moved at once, not around her, just behind her back, braced against the wooden rail in case she fell. When the wagon settled, he lowered it again without comment. Molly noticed. Grace knew because her daughter looked out at the trees with far too much concentration. A little before noon, they passed through a heavy timber gate marked with a weathered sign. Pine Hollow. Beyond it, the country opened. Grace had expected a large ranch. She had not expected an entire valley. Fenced pasture rolled beneath the snow toward dark foothills. Black cattle gathered near windbreaks. Smoke rose from a bunkhouse, a blacksmith shed, and 2 barns large enough to swallow the building behind Parker's store. The main house stood on slightly higher ground. It was broad, built of squared pine logs, with a stone chimney and a deep front porch supported by rough-hewn posts. It should have looked welcoming. It didn't. Everything was sound. Everything was maintained. Everything felt quiet. Too quiet. Jacob pulled the wagon near the porch. Before he could climb down, the front door opened. A thin boy in a wool shirt appeared. He looked 13 or 14, with dark hair and a face that became guarded the moment he saw strangers. "Adam," Jacob called. "Come lend a hand." The boy stepped onto the porch. His eyes moved from Grace to Molly, then to their trunk. Not unfriendly, just careful. Jacob gestured toward him. "My older nephew." "Adam." Grace smiled. "I'm Grace Miller. This is Molly." Adam nodded. "Ma'am." Another face appeared behind him. This one belonged to a much smaller boy. He shoved past Adam, stopped at the porch edge, and stared openly at Molly. "Are you staying?" Molly looked at Grace. "For a while." The boy brightened immediately. "Good." Adam closed his eyes. "Eli." "What? You haven't even said hello." "Oh." The boy straightened. "Hello?" Molly's mouth twitched. Jacob climbed down from the wagon. "That one's Eli." "I had guessed," Grace said. Jacob looked at her. For the first time since Red Creek, she saw something almost amused in his face. Almost. The ranch hands appeared gradually. Some came from the barn, others from the bunkhouse. Men in heavy coats and worn gloves, stamping snow from their boots, curious about the new cook who had agreed to spend winter at Pine Hollow. Jacob introduced Grace only once. "This is Mrs. Miller. She'll be running the kitchen." That was it. No warning about manners. No explanation of her circumstances. No reminder that she was a widow. Grace appreciated that more than she expected. The house was larger inside than it appeared from the yard. A central hall ran past a parlor nobody seemed to use, and into a dining room with a long pine table scarred by years of knives, plates, elbows, and hot pans. Beyond it sat the kitchen. Grace stopped in the doorway. 2 work tables, a large iron cook stove, stone sink, shelves, a pantry deep enough to walk into, copper pots hanging from hooks, sacks of flour and cornmeal stacked beneath one wall. Jacob had been truthful. The kitchen was usable. More than usable. It had simply been neglected by men who regarded food as something that appeared when necessary and vanished when finished. Grace opened the pantry. Salt pork, dried beans, potatoes, onions, apples beginning to wrinkle, several beef bones wrapped in cloth that somebody clearly intended to throw to the dogs. She looked back at Jacob. When was the last time anyone sorted this? He leaned against the doorway. Cook did. When did he leave? 3 weeks ago. Grace stared at him. Jacob cleared his throat. I've been busy. So has the mold. Molly covered a cough with one hand. Grace pointed toward the pump. Does that work? Until the pipe freezes. And where's the well? Past the south porch. Wood? Stacked behind the kitchen. Good. Jacob shifted his weight. Need anything else? Grace looked around. Not yet. He nodded once and disappeared. That afternoon she unpacked very little. 1 dress. Molly's books. 2 aprons. The flour-stained recipe book. Their rooms were upstairs at the back of the house, separated by a narrow connecting door. Molly's had a small window overlooking the barn. Grace's had a washstand, a chest, a plain wooden bed, and a braided rug that looked as if nobody had stepped on it in months. You think we'll like it here? Molly asked. Grace hung her coat on a peg. We're working here. That isn't what I asked. You're getting too fond of saying that. I learned it from you. Grace turned. Molly looked innocent. It was not convincing. By 4 o'clock, Grace had begun supper. Nothing elaborate. Beef stew with onions and potatoes, biscuits, stewed apples sweetened with a little molasses. She chose simplicity deliberately. A new kitchen had its own habits. A stove pulled differently. Flour behaved differently depending on storage, and 18 hungry cowboys were not the audience for experimentation. The first man entered the dining room before she called anyone. He stood by the door pretending he had business with a chair. Grace looked at him. Hungry? Just checking the weather. From inside? He removed his hat. Smells good. Sit down before somebody takes your place. That was all it took. Within 10 minutes, the table was full. Boots scraped floorboards. Spoons struck bowls. Coffee moved from hand to hand in thick white mugs, some chipped at the rims. At first the men were quiet. Then somebody asked for another biscuit. Someone else passed the butter. Eli announced that the apples were better than the ones Adam had burned the week before. I did not burn them, Adam said. They were black, caramelized. You learned that word yesterday. Molly laughed. Adam turned red. Grace looked down at the stew so he would not catch her smiling. Jacob sat at the head of the table. He ate steadily, not quickly, not slowly. Grace noticed that he listened more than he spoke. When a ranch hand complained about a north fence post leaning after the last snow, Jacob asked 3 questions and gave 1 answer. When Adam reminded him about a cracked hinge in the horse barn, he nodded and said he'd see to it in the morning. When Eli dropped a spoon, Jacob picked it up before the boy could climb under the table. Simple things. Grace stored them away. Eli finished his bowl, then a second. On the third, Grace stopped him. You'll regret that. I won't. You will. How do you know? Experience. Did you eat 3 bowls once? No. I raised a daughter. Molly looked offended. Mother. The men laughed. Even Adam. Jacob's eyes lifted toward Grace. For one brief moment she caught him watching her. Not her hands, not the food. Her. Then he looked back at his plate. The room changed as supper went on. Men who normally ate and left stayed for coffee. Adam brought Molly one of the old school books kept in the parlor. Eli asked whether she knew how to play checkers. One ranch hand told a story about a cow getting loose inside the tack room. And by the time he reached the end, half the table was arguing about whose fault it had been. Grace stood near the stove listening. It had been a long time since she had heard that much noise around supper. She hadn't known she missed it. When the last bowl was cleared, Jacob remained at the table. Grace wiped her hands. Well? He looked up. Well, what? The supper. He glanced toward the empty serving bowl. It was good. Grace waited. Jacob seemed to realize she expected more. He leaned back slightly. Nothing special, but good. The room went silent. A coffee mug stopped halfway to someone's mouth. Adam stared at the table. Molly looked directly at Jacob. Grace felt the words land with a familiarity she hated. Not special. Useful. Dependable. Good enough. She smiled. It was the smile she had used on customers in Red Creek when they said something she would not give the dignity of an argument. I'm glad it was satisfactory. Jacob's brow tightened. He had heard something in her voice. Too late. Grace took his bowl. Anyone else? Nobody answered. She carried the dishes into the kitchen. Molly followed a minute later. Mother. Bring those cups. He's an idiot. Molly. He is. Cups. Molly gathered them angrily. Grace washed dishes until her hands turned pink from hot water. She told herself Jacob had meant nothing by it. That was almost certainly true. Strangely, that made it worse. Later, upstairs, Molly sat on her bed while Grace opened the trunk. From beneath 2 folded dresses, Grace lifted an embroidered apron. Small blue flowers ran along the hem. William had bought it from a traveling merchant in Nebraska during their 2nd year of marriage. He had given it to her that because she once complained every apron she owned looked like flour sacks tied around her waist. She had laughed at him for spending money on embroidery, then worn it until the cloth had thinned. Grace ran her thumb across one faded flower. Molly watched. You were going to wear that here? Maybe. Why aren't you? Grace folded it carefully. It's too good for everyday work. Molly's eyes narrowed. She knew that was not the whole answer. Grace put the apron beneath the dresses, closed the trunk, turned the key. Before dawn the next morning, she was already downstairs. The house remained dark except for the kitchen lamp. She tied on her plain apron, opened the pantry, and began sorting what others had ignored. Bones went into the stockpot. Onion ends followed, a handful of barley, cold water. She set the pot over low heat. Behind her, a floorboard creaked. Grace turned. Jacob stood in the doorway, hair uncombed, suspenders hanging loose over his work shirt. He looked at the pot. What are you doing? Cooking. At 5 in the morning? Stock takes time. He stepped closer and looked inside. Those are scraps. Exactly. Jacob glanced at her. Grace pushed the lid into place. I'm making something useful out of what everyone else overlooks. The words landed differently than she intended. Jacob went still. Grace picked up a sack of onions and carried it toward the pantry. When she passed him, he stepped aside. Neither said anything. But after breakfast, Grace found a fresh armload of split wood stacked beside the stove. No one mentioned who had brought it. She didn't ask. Still, when she fed another log into the fire and heard Jacob's boots crossing the porch outside, her hand remained on the stove door a second longer than necessary. Over the next 2 weeks, Pine Hollow changed without anyone deciding that it should. Grace never announced rules. She simply began doing things differently. Bones that once went to the dogs simmered overnight in the black stockpot. Stale bread became pudding or thickener. Fat skimmed from stew was saved in a covered crock beside the stove. She moved the flour away from the damp wall, hung onions in netting where air could reach them, and wrote the pantry count in pencil on the back of an old feed receipt. Molly helped after lessons. Adam pretended not to. Eli did not pretend anything. What are you writing? How much flour we have? Why? So I know when we are running low. Uncle Jacob knows that. Grace looked toward the boy. Does he? Eli considered the question. No. Grace smiled. By the middle of the second week, the men had stopped leaving the table immediately after supper. At first they stayed for coffee, then for another biscuit, then because someone always had a story. One evening, a ranch hand named Pete Lawson told how he had once tried to rope a calf and accidentally caught the hind leg of his own horse. Nobody believed him. Pete insisted. Adam asked 3 questions designed to expose the lie. Molly asked 1 and succeeded. Eli laughed so hard milk came out his nose. Grace turned toward the stove so the boy would not see her laughing too. From the head of the table came a low sound. She looked over. Jacob Dawson was smiling. Not widely, barely enough to change his face, but it was there. When he realized she had caught him, the smile vanished. Grace returned to the stove before her own could grow. Jacob also began appearing for supper earlier. The first few times Grace assumed coincidence. Then she noticed patterns. If the men returned late from the south pasture, Jacob still found a reason to come through the house before riding back out. If snow delayed fence work, he shifted it until morning. Once he arrived at the back door while Grace was setting a roast on the table, snow clinging to his shoulders. Thought you were checking the east line, she said. I was. That is 2 miles from here. Yes, and you came back for supper? Jacob removed his gloves. Men have to eat. Grace glanced past him. None of the other men were there yet. Jacob followed her eyes, then cleared his throat. I'll wash up. Grace said nothing. At the table he took 2 helpings. She did not ask whether they were special. The house itself seemed to notice the difference. The parlor lamp began burning in the evenings. Molly read aloud sometimes while Adam worked through arithmetic at the end of the dining table. Eli played checkers with whoever could be trapped into sitting across from him. Jacob was a terrible checkers player. Grace discovered this by accident. "You left that open," Eli told him. Jacob frowned at the board. "I know, you didn't." "I did." Eli jumped one piece, then another. Jacob stared. Grace, kneading dough at the kitchen table, pressed her lips together. Jacob looked toward her. "You have something to say?" "No." "You're laughing." "I am working." "You're laughing while working." "I can do two things." Molly buried her face in a book. Adam muttered, "He is bad at it." Jacob pointed at him. "You're next." Adam suddenly became very interested in arithmetic. It was a small thing. So small, Grace almost missed what sat beneath it. Noise had returned to the house. Not constant noise. Not chaos. Just the ordinary sounds of people expecting one another to be there. Then, one bitter evening near the end of January, Eli came home from the lower pasture, pale and quiet. That alone made Grace look twice. Eli was never quiet. He stepped through the mudroom behind Jacob, pulled off one glove, then leaned against the wall. Grace was carrying a pan from the stove. "What happened?" "Nothing," Eli said. Jacob hung his coat. He complained his stomach hurt on the ride back. "I didn't complain. You said it 4 times. That isn't complaining." Grace crossed the room and touched the boy's forehead. "Cool." She looked at him. "Sit." "I'm fine." "Then you can be fine in a chair." Eli obeyed. At supper, he ate 3 bites, then pushed the bowl away. Jacob noticed. "You sick?" "No." Grace watched Eli swallow. The boy's face tightened. She moved quickly. Outside. He barely reached the porch before becoming ill into the snow. Jacob followed at once. Grace was already beside Eli, holding his shoulders while the boy crouched near the steps. When it passed, she wiped his mouth with the corner of a clean cloth. "Easy." Jacob hovered behind them. "What is it?" Grace stood. "I don't know yet." "What did he eat?" "The same as everyone else." "Could be something from the creek?" "Could be." Jacob frowned toward the yard as if the answer might be somewhere in the dark. Grace took Eli's arm. Inside. The boy worsened through the evening. By 9, he could keep almost nothing down. Grace moved him to his bed upstairs and sent Molly for a basin. Adam stood in the doorway. "Is he going to be all right?" Grace looked at him. "He needs rest and water." "That isn't what I asked." The words were so like Molly's that Grace almost smiled. Instead, she said, "Right now, I don't see anything that tells me otherwise." Adam nodded. He did not move. Grace softened her voice. "You can sit with him if you want." Adam pulled the chair closer. Jacob remained in the hall. Every time Grace passed the doorway, he was somewhere nearby, never entering fully. Once she found him standing near the staircase with a coffee mug gone cold between both hands. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you. I am not the one pretending I might accidentally wander past this room every 5 minutes." Jacob looked at her. Grace held his gaze. For a moment she thought he might argue. Instead, he glanced toward Eli's door. He was 5 when his mother died. Grace waited. Jacob's thumb moved once along the rim of the mug. Adam remembers more. And Eli? Some. Jacob looked down. Not enough. Grace understood the rest without hearing it. She opened the bedroom door wider. You can come in. Jacob shook his head. He'll rest better. He might. Grace stepped aside. Or he might like knowing you're there. Jacob did not move. Grace let him choose. She returned to Eli. Near midnight, the boy finally kept down 2 spoonfuls of weak broth. Grace waited several minutes, then another. Eli opened one eye. That tastes terrible. Good. Why is that good? Means you can taste it. He made a face. Grace gave him another spoon. From the hall came the faintest sound. Jacob almost laughed. Grace looked toward the door. He was still there. This time he stepped inside. He took the chair at the foot of the bed, too small for him. His knees rose awkwardly. Eli looked toward him. You look stupid in that chair. Jacob nodded. Drink your broth. Grace lowered her eyes to hide her smile. They stayed that way for hours. Adam eventually went to bed. Molly curled beneath a blanket in Grace's room. The house went quiet. Eli slept in short stretches. Whenever he stirred, Grace checked him, gave him water, then broth. Jacob said little. At some point after 3, Grace's head began to drop. She sat beside Eli with one hand loosely around his wrist, feeling the steady pulse beneath his skin. Her eyes closed. She did not mean to sleep. Near dawn, Jacob rose from the chair. He looked down at Grace. Her head leaned against the bedpost. A strand of hair had escaped its pins and fallen across her cheek. Her hand remained wrapped around Eli's wrist even in sleep. Jacob stood there for several seconds. Then he removed his heavy coat. Carefully, so carefully that the wool barely made a sound, he laid it across Grace's shoulders. She woke. Her eyes opened slowly. Jacob was bent over her, one enormous hand still holding the edge of the coat. Neither moved. The room was dim. Blue morning light showed along the curtains. Grace could smell leather, cold air, and faint wood smoke in the coat around her. Jacob's face was close enough that she could see the small pale scar near his jaw. His eyes dropped toward hers, then toward her mouth. Only for a moment. Grace's breath caught. Jacob straightened too quickly. Cold in here, he said. Grace touched the coat. It isn't. No. He looked away. Grace did too. The silence between them felt different from all the other silences in that house. Then Eli moved beneath the blankets. Grace leaned forward. Hey there. His eyes opened. The color in his face was better. He swallowed. Aunt Grace? The room stopped. Grace stared at him. Jacob did too. Eli seemed too sleepy to realize what he had said. Can I have water? Grace recovered first. Of course. She reached for the cup. Behind her, Jacob went perfectly still. Grace handed Eli the water. He drank. When she turned back, Jacob was looking at the boy. His face held something she could not name at first. Not jealousy, not anger. Something quieter, something sharper. Fear. Eli had begun making room for Grace. So had Adam. So had the men downstairs. Maybe the whole house had. Grace looked at Jacob. He felt her watching and turned toward her. For once, neither of them looked away quickly. Jacob nodded toward the coat around her shoulders. Keep it until you're warm. Then he stepped into the hall. Grace listened to his boots move down the stairs. Eli had already closed his eyes again. She sat beside him with Jacob's coat around her and one hand resting on the child's blanket. For the first time since arriving at Pine Hollow, Grace wondered whether Jacob Dawson was afraid she might leave. Then another thought came. Perhaps he was more afraid that everyone had already begun wanting her to stay. Grace carried that thought with her for the next several days and did her best not to give it too much room. Pine Hollow had enough work without adding imagination to the list. Eli recovered quickly. By the following afternoon, he was downstairs arguing with Molly over a checkerboard, as though he had not spent half the night too weak to sit up. Adam pretended not to watch him so closely, but Grace noticed the way he kept finding reasons to pass through the room. Jacob noticed too. He said nothing. That seemed to be his way with most things that mattered. The weather settled into a bitter stretch. Snow hardened along the north side of the house. The water pump froze twice before breakfast, and every morning the ranch hands came through the mudroom stamping ice from their boots. Grace adjusted. She always did. When the pantry shelf proved too high, she dragged over a flour crate and stood on it. When the kitchen window leaked cold air around the frame, she folded an old flour sack and stuffed it into the gap. When the wooden handle on the flour bin loosened, she learned to lift from the bottom. None of those things seemed worth troubling anyone over. Then one morning she walked into the pantry and stopped. The high shelf had been lowered. Not much. 4 inches, perhaps. Enough that Grace could reach the crock of dried beans without climbing onto anything. She stared at it. Fresh screw marks showed pale against the wood. Jacob came through the kitchen carrying a coil of rope. Grace looked at him. "Did you do this?" He followed her gaze. "The shelf?" "Yes. It was too high." "I managed." "I saw." His eyes moved toward the flour crate. "I also saw how." Grace crossed her arms. "You have a habit of fixing things nobody asks you to fix." Jacob considered that. Could be worse habits. Then he walked outside. Grace stood there several seconds longer. The following day, the kitchen window no longer whistled. 2 days after that, the flour bin handle had been replaced with a piece of smooth oak. Jacob never mentioned either repair. Neither did Grace. It became a quiet game neither admitted they were playing. She noticed when he came into the kitchen looking for coffee even when a pot already sat in the ranch office. He noticed when she saved the crisp end of the cornbread, because he always reached for it first. She began setting one aside without thinking. He began leaving extra split cedar beside the stove because it caught faster on cold mornings. Neither thanked the other. The small things passed between them without names. One afternoon, Grace carried a basket of linens from the clothesline behind the house and stepped badly on a patch of frozen mud. Her right boot bent beneath her. The sole pulled loose near the toe with a soft, tearing sound. Grace looked down. No. Molly, carrying clothespins behind her, winced. "That doesn't look good. It looks fine. It is talking." Grace took another step. The sole flapped against the ground. Molly raised an eyebrow. "Very fine." Grace made it to the kitchen, dried the boot near the stove, and found a hammer and several small nails in the drawer where Jacob kept household tools. She had repaired shoes before. Not well, but well enough. By evening, the boot held together. The following morning, it was gone. Grace searched beneath the table, beside the stove, under her bed. Molly. Her daughter looked up from fastening her dress. "Did you move my boot?" "No, Adam?" "No." "Eli?" "Mother." Eli would have left a trail. Fair point. Grace found Jacob in the barn. He stood near the tack wall fitting a new strap to a bridle. His sleeves rolled to his forearms. Her boot sat on the workbench beside him. The sole had been removed and properly stitched back into place. Grace stopped in the doorway. "Mr. Dawson." Jacob did not look up. That told her immediately he knew why she was there. "You stole my boot. I borrowed it. You took it from my room. It was outside your door." Grace opened her mouth, closed it. That is not the important part. Jacob finally looked at her. What is? I can repair my own things. I know. Then why are you doing it? He set the bridle down. For a moment, the barn seemed unusually quiet. Horses shifted behind stall doors. Snowmelt ticked from the roof into a bucket near the wall. Jacob picked up the boot and held it toward her. You mend something around here every day. Grace stared at him. He continued, quieter. The boys, the pantry, shirts the men tear even though nobody pays you to. Whatever Eli drags through the kitchen. Half the time, people don't notice. His hand remained extended. Let me mend one thing for you. Grace looked at the repaired boot, then at him. There was no pity in his face. That mattered, more than she wanted it to. She took the boot. Their fingers brushed. Jacob released it immediately. Grace did not. Not at first. She kept her hand where it was for half a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then she stepped back. Thank you. His expression changed slightly. Perhaps because she said it. Perhaps because she meant it. You're welcome. Grace turned toward the door. Mrs. Miller. She looked back. Jacob nodded toward the boot. Don't wear it until the stitching dries. Yes, sir. His brow lifted. Grace smiled before she could stop herself. For the next week, that smile came too easily. She caught Jacob watching her while she rolled biscuit dough. Once, while she was laughing at something Molly whispered. Another time when she reached above her head to hang dried herbs and felt his eyes on her long enough that she nearly dropped the bundle. He always looked away when caught. But not quickly enough. And Grace, despite herself, began noticing him too. The way he bent instinctively beneath every doorway. The small scar across his left thumb. The fact that he never drank more than 1 cup of coffee after supper. The way his voice changed when speaking to Eli. The way he listened when Adam talked, even when the boy took too long to reach his point. None of it was wise. Grace knew that. Then Sarah Collins arrived. It was a clear Thursday afternoon, bright enough that sunlight flashed painfully across the snow. Grace heard sleigh bells from the yard. A neat cutter stopped beside the porch, driven by a hired boy from Red Creek. The woman who stepped down looked exactly like the sort of woman Grace had spent a lifetime learning not to compare herself to. Sarah Collins was perhaps 32, tall but delicately built, with pale blonde hair tucked beneath a dark green bonnet. Her fitted wool coat showed a narrow waist, and her gloves matched the trim at her collar. She carried 2 baskets. Jacob came around the barn when he heard the bells. Sarah. The ease in his voice was enough. Sarah smiled. Jacob. Not Mr. Dawson. Not formal. Jacob took 1 basket from her without asking. Road all right? Until the last mile. Your north turn is still miserable. I'll have someone clear it. You said that last winter. Jacob almost smiled. Grace stood behind the kitchen window with a dishcloth in her hands. She realized she had stopped drying the plate. Molly noticed. Of course she did. Who is she? Grace resumed wiping. I don't know. Molly looked toward the yard. She is pretty, yes. Grace set the plate down, a little harder than necessary. Sarah entered 5 minutes later carrying church donations for families stranded farther up the valley. Blankets, dried fruit, 2 jars of preserves, a packet of sewing needles. She was gracious. That made everything worse. You must be Mrs. Miller, Sarah said warmly. Helen Parker told me Pine Hollow finally found someone willing to take charge of these men. Grace shook her hand. Only their meals. Sarah laughed. Then you've taken charge of the most dangerous part. She complimented the kitchen, asked Molly about her lessons, spoke kindly to Eli. There was nothing Grace could dislike, nothing she could use to protect herself. At supper, Sarah stayed because the road back to Red Creek had begun icing over. She sat near Jacob. They talked about people Grace did not know. A church roof, a cattle auction from the previous autumn, someone named Benjamin who had married badly. Jacob spoke more than usual. Not much, but enough. Grace moved between stove and table. She told herself she was working. That was all. Yet when Sarah leaned closer to Jacob to say something beneath the noise of the men, Grace felt something tighten beneath her ribs. Later, after Sarah had gone upstairs to Molly's room, and Molly had moved temporarily into Grace's, Jacob found Grace alone in the kitchen. She was stacking plates. "You're quiet tonight. I've been busy." Jacob leaned against the doorway. "Sarah talks enough for 3 people." Grace smiled faintly. "She seems kind." "She is." A pause. Grace placed another plate onto the shelf. "She's very beautiful." Jacob looked at her. Grace wished immediately that she had not said it. "Yes," he answered. "Nothing more." He probably meant nothing by it. Again. Grace turned back to the dishes. "When spring comes, Molly and I will return to Red Creek." The room went still. Jacob straightened. "What?" "My agreement was through winter. I know what the agreement was." Grace folded the dishcloth. "Then there is no surprise." "You've decided already?" "I am planning ahead." "For what?" "Work. You have work here. Until spring." Jacob stared at her. Grace could feel it without looking. Finally she did. The expression on his face stopped her. Not anger, not irritation. Shock. As if the possibility of her leaving had not simply displeased him. As if it had never occurred to him at all. Grace's fingers tightened around the dishcloth. Jacob opened his mouth. Then Sarah's footsteps sounded overhead. Whatever he had been about to say disappeared. Grace looked away first. "Good night, Mr. Dawson." "Grace." She stopped at the kitchen door. He had used her first name before, but never like that. She waited. Jacob stood beside the long table, enormous and strangely uncertain, the light from the lamp cutting shadows across his face. Still, he said nothing. Grace went upstairs. Behind her, Jacob remained alone in the kitchen, with 2 untouched coffee mugs, and the first clear knowledge that winter would eventually end. And when it did, Grace Miller intended to leave. Sarah Collins rode back to Red Creek the next morning after breakfast. She thanked Grace twice for the room, complimented the biscuits, kissed Eli on the forehead, shook Adam's hand as though he were already a grown man. Then she climbed into the cutter, tucked a fur lap robe around her knees, and disappeared down the north road beneath a sky the color of tin. Grace watched from the kitchen window until the sleigh bells faded. She told herself she was relieved. That was almost true. The house felt easier after Sarah left. But Jacob did not. He became quieter. Not cold, just watchful. At supper he spoke when someone asked him something, then fell silent again. When Grace crossed the room carrying coffee, she caught him looking at her twice. The third time she stopped. "Is there something wrong with the coffee?" "No." "The stew?" "No." "Then why are you staring at me?" Half the table suddenly found its plates fascinating. Jacob lowered his eyes. "I wasn't." Grace raised one brow. Molly coughed into her napkin. Adam looked dangerously close to smiling. Jacob took a drink of coffee. Nobody said another word. The conversation Grace knew was coming waited until the following night. It was nearly 10. The boys had gone upstairs. Molly had taken a book to bed. Wind dragged fine snow across the porch boards in a dry hiss. Grace stood at the kitchen table counting sacks from the pantry and marking numbers on the back of a feed receipt. Flour, 6. Barley, 3. Dried beans, 4.5. Salt, enough until the next supply run, if Pete stopped spilling it. She heard Jacob enter behind her. He closed the door. Grace kept writing. "You're planning to leave." It was not a question. She set down the pencil. "I told you that. You told me your contract ends in spring." "Yes, that isn't the same thing." Grace turned. Jacob stood beside the stove with his hat in one hand. He had come in from the barn not long before. Cold still clung to his coat. "What would you like me to say? Why?" Grace looked at him. "Why what?" "Why you've already decided." "I have not decided anything dramatic." "You're leaving." "That is not dramatic." "It is to me." The words came too quickly. Jacob seemed almost surprised by them himself. Grace's expression changed. "Just a little." Jacob set his hat on the table. "Why?" Grace crossed her arms. "You hired me through winter. I can change the arrangement." "That isn't the point." "Then tell me the point." Grace looked toward the dark window. For several seconds, she said nothing. Jacob waited. That helped. If he had pushed, she might have walked out. Instead, she drew a slow breath. "Do you remember my first supper here?" Jacob frowned. "Yes." "What did you say?" His eyes shifted. Grace saw the moment memory arrived. "It was good." "And?" Jacob's jaw tightened. "Grace, and?" "Nothing special." There it was. The words sounded worse in the empty kitchen than they had at the crowded table. Jacob looked down. "I shouldn't have said it that way." "No. I meant the food was simple." "I know." Grace picked up the pencil, then set it down again. "That is the trouble." Jacob looked at her. Grace's voice remained calm. Too calm. "I know you meant nothing by it." "I didn't." "I know." She rubbed her thumb along the edge of the receipt. "I've spent most of my life hearing things people meant nothing by." Jacob did not move. Grace continued. "Men praising my pies while joking that I must keep half for myself. Women asking whether I ever considered wearing darker colors because they make a woman look smaller. People telling me I have such a kind face." Jacob's brow drew together. "That sounds like a compliment." "It can be." She met his eyes. "It can also be what people say when they cannot think of anything else." The stove gave a soft pop. Grace looked away. "My husband never made me feel that way." Jacob's face changed at the mention of him. Grace rarely spoke about William. After he died, she said, "I learned something." She folded the receipt once, then unfolded it. People like having a woman around who can make things easier. Jacob said nothing. Feed them. Clean up after them. Sit beside a sickbed. Mend a sleeve. Watch their children. Keep the room pleasant. Make sure everyone else is comfortable. Her mouth tightened. "They'll tell you she's wonderful." She looked at him. "They'll tell you she's dependable." Another pause. "But when it comes time to choose someone to stand beside them, they look somewhere else." Jacob's expression hardened. "Who did that to you?" Grace almost laughed. Not because it was funny, Does it matter? Yes. No, it doesn't. She shook her head. Because it wasn't one person. Jacob stood very still. Grace continued before she lost the nerve. I came here to work. I did the work. Then the house started changing. Her eyes moved briefly toward the ceiling where the children slept. So did the boys. Jacob's shoulders shifted. So did you. His gaze lifted. Grace swallowed. That is what frightens me. Me? No. She almost smiled. Not exactly. Jacob waited. Grace's voice grew quieter. I know how to be useful. The words landed harder than anything she had said before. I know how to be needed. Jacob looked at her. I don't know how to trust that being needed means anything else. The room went silent. Grace pressed her hands flat against the table. I will not stay here long enough to become the woman everyone depends on and then discover I misunderstood what that dependence meant. Jacob stepped closer. Grace, that's not... Isn't it? No. What is it then? He stopped. Grace looked straight at him. Tell me. Jacob opened his mouth. She waited. He looked toward the stairs. Eli needs you. Grace's face changed. Very little. Adam trusts you. She said nothing. The men respect you. Still nothing. This ranch runs better with you here. Grace's eyes dropped to the table. Jacob heard himself too late. Every reason was true. Every reason was also exactly what she feared. He took another step. That's not all. Then what else? Jacob stopped again. Grace looked up. There was no anger on her face now. That was worse. Only patience. The kind given to a man being allowed one chance to tell the truth. Jacob's chest rose slowly. He looked toward her hands. Grace followed his gaze. Flour had dried in the small lines near her knuckles. One finger carried a shallow burn from the oven door. These hands, she said. Jacob looked at her. If I couldn't cook tomorrow. He went still. If I couldn't stand at that stove. She lifted one hand between them. If I couldn't mend your boys' clothes. If I couldn't nurse anyone. If I stopped making this place easier. Her voice almost broke. Almost. Would you still ask me to stay? Jacob stared at her. The question seemed to strip the room bare. No kitchen, no children, no ranch, no usefulness. Only Grace. He knew the answer should have come easily. That frightened him, because something rose in him too large and too unfamiliar to shape quickly into words. Grace waited. 1 second. 2. 3. Jacob's silence did what cruelty could not have done. It answered her. She nodded once. I thought so, no. Grace gathered the receipt. Grace. He reached toward her, stopped before touching her. She noticed that too. Don't. His hand lowered. I wasn't saying no. You weren't saying anything. I was trying to find the right words. She looked tired suddenly. Not angry. Just tired. I have spent too much of my life waiting for men to discover the right words after their actions already told me what they meant. Jacob flinched. Grace regretted it immediately. She closed her eyes. I shouldn't have said that. You had a husband who loved you. Yes. And I'm not him. No. The answer was soft. That isn't what I meant. Jacob looked down. Grace folded the receipt carefully and put it beside the flour ledger. I don't want you to be William. Jacob's gaze returned to her. I wouldn't know how. I know. Grace swallowed. I don't even know if I want what I think I want. That was the first thing she had said all evening that sounded frightened. Jacob heard it. Grace picked up the lamp. But I know I cannot build another life around being useful enough that people decide to keep me. She moved toward the stairs. Grace! She stopped with one hand on the banister. Jacob stood by the kitchen table. The giant man looked suddenly lost inside his own house. I am sorry, he said. Grace looked back. For the supper? For not understanding the question sooner. Her fingers tightened around the lamp handle. Jacob continued, and for not having an answer ready. Grace waited. He did not try to dress it up, did not promise what he did not yet know how to say. That honesty hurt. It also kept her standing there. I'd rather have a slow truth than a quick lie, she said. Then she climbed the stairs. Jacob listened until her bedroom door closed. The fire in the stove had burned low. He sat at the long table alone. One of Grace's pencils lay beside the feed receipt. He picked it up, set it down. From upstairs came the faint creak of a floorboard. Then silence. Jacob stared into the dark kitchen. Before Grace arrived, this room had never bothered him. It was only a room. Now every chair seemed to hold the shape of someone who might be gone in a few weeks. He thought about Eli calling her Aunt Grace, Adam asking her opinion without realizing he was doing it, Molly leaving her books beside the parlor lamp, Grace standing at the stove with her sleeves rolled above her elbows. He thought about her question. If I brought you nothing but myself, would you still ask me to stay? Jacob leaned both hands against the table. For the first time in years, he was not afraid of losing something he already had. He was afraid he might have waited too long to understand what he wanted before it walked out the door. The next morning, Jacob did not try to stop Grace on the stairs. He did not corner her in the kitchen. He did not arrive with some speech polished overnight beside the dying stove. He came in before sunrise with frost on his coat, poured coffee into a thick white mug, and asked whether she needed more firewood. Grace looked at him across the stove. No. There's enough. He nodded. All right. That was it. The quiet that followed lasted 3 days. Not an angry quiet. That might have been easier. They spoke when work required it. Grace told Jacob when the flour delivery needed ordering. Jacob told Grace which men would miss supper because they were moving cattle from the north pasture. She asked whether he wanted coffee. He said yes. He thanked her. She said, "You're welcome." Polite words, careful words, words that carried nothing sharp enough to cut and nothing warm enough to mend. The children noticed. Eli noticed first because Eli noticed anything that interfered with supper conversation. On the second evening, he looked from Grace to Jacob and frowned. Are you too mad? Adam kicked him beneath the table. Eli jerked. Ow! Eat! I am eating. Then do it quietly. Eli pointed his spoon at Jacob. Uncle Jacob's been quiet all day. Adam stared at him. He's quiet every day. Not this kind. Molly lowered her eyes to her plate. Grace reached for the bread basket. Eli, would you like another biscuit? Yes. The subject disappeared beneath butter, but not completely. Jacob had heard. So had Grace. After supper, Grace expected him to leave for the ranch office as usual. Instead, he remained. Adam had arithmetic spread across the table, slate on one side, pencil nub on the other. Jacob stood over his shoulder. How'd you get 16? Adam pointed. 4 times 4. That part I understand. Then why did you ask? Because the line above says 3 times 4. Adam looked down. Silence. Molly, reading nearby, pressed her lips together. Jacob pulled out a chair. It groaned beneath his weight. Start again. Adam looked embarrassed. I can do it. I know, then. Start again. There was no impatience in Jacob's voice. Adam erased the sum. Jacob stayed beside him until he got it right. The next evening, he sat with Eli during reading. The boy stumbled over the same word 4 times. Jacob did not correct him immediately. He waited. Eli sounded it out, then looked up. Jacob nodded once. Again. Grace watched from the kitchen doorway. She had spent weeks doing those things herself because somebody needed to. Now Jacob was doing them. Not for show. Not while looking toward her to see whether she noticed. Sometimes that mattered most. 2 nights later, Molly sat beside the parlor lamp reading from an old geography book when Jacob stopped on his way upstairs. What's that? Molly looked up. Territories. Anything useful? She considered. Utah has a salt lake. I knew that. Did you know it is large enough that people say the water feels different when you swim? Jacob paused. No. Molly held the book slightly higher. It says so here. He stepped closer. Grace, mending a shirt near the stove, looked down at her needle. A few minutes later, Jacob was still standing there while Molly read him half a page. The household had always revolved around his work. Now, slowly, he was learning to stand still inside other people's lives. Grace did not know what to do with that. On the 4th night, after the ranch hands had gone, Jacob began carrying dishes into the kitchen. Grace looked over. You don't have to do that. I know. He picked up another plate. She almost smiled despite herself. Instead, she said, You're stacking them wrong. Jacob looked down at the plates. They're plates. The bowls go separately. Why? So they don't slide. He considered the stack. They aren't sliding. Grace walked over, took the top bowl, and moved it. They will. Jacob watched her hands, then nodded. All right. For one brief second, the old ease returned. It vanished almost as quickly. Grace turned away. Jacob dried the plates without another word. The silence between them was not empty anymore. It was crowded with things neither one had figured out how to say. Several nights later, snow began falling just after dusk. Not a storm. A slow, steady fall that softened the yard and covered wagon tracks 1 inch at a time. Grace woke after midnight. She did not know why at first. Then she heard the porch board creak beneath weight. She sat up. Molly slept in the adjoining room. The house was quiet. Grace pulled on her wool wrapper, slipped her feet into shoes, and went downstairs. The kitchen was dark except for embers in the stove. She opened the front door. Jacob sat on the porch step. No coat, only his work shirt and vest, hat resting beside him. Snow had collected along his shoulders. Grace frowned. You're going to freeze. He did not turn. Probably. She stepped outside and pulled the door almost shut behind her. Cold bit immediately through her wrapper. You have a coat. Yes. Inside. Yes. Grace folded her arms. Good talk. That finally made him glance at her. The corner of his mouth shifted. Grace sat on the porch bench, leaving a careful distance between them. Snow whispered through the yard. Farther out, one of the horses moved inside the barn, hooves knocking softly against a stall. For a while, neither spoke. Jacob rubbed his palms together. Then he said, My brother's name was Daniel. Grace turned her head. He had never spoken about him. Adam and Eli's father? Yes. Jacob looked across the dark yard. He was younger than me. A pause. Not by much. Grace waited. He could talk to anybody. Jacob picked up a little snow from the porch rail and let it fall between his fingers. Salesmen, drunks, preachers, children, didn't matter. Daniel could sit down beside a stranger and 10 minutes later know half his life. Grace looked at Jacob. You are not like that. No. His answer was so dry she almost laughed. Jacob continued. He married Rebecca when he was 26. His voice changed slightly on the name. She was loud. Grace smiled. That sounds affectionate. It is. He looked down. They had Adam 2 years later. Eli after that. Snow gathered along the brim of his hat beside him. Grace did not interrupt. Jacob swallowed once. Daniel died first. She waited. Riding accident? No. His jaw tightened. Fever. Grace's gaze lowered. Rebecca held on for months after. He rubbed one hand over the other. Then her lungs went bad that winter. Grace understood before he finished. She died too. Jacob nodded. When Daniel got sick, I was 40 miles north buying cattle. His voice had gone quieter. By the time I got back, he was already gone. Grace stared at the snow beyond the porch. I'm sorry. Jacob nodded once. I buried him without saying goodbye. The wind shifted. A few flakes blew under the porch roof. Jacob did not seem to notice. After Rebecca died, the boys came here. They were already family. Yes, but? Jacob leaned his forearms on his knees. But feeding them wasn't hard. Grace looked toward him. Clothing them wasn't hard. His voice stayed steady. Keeping a roof over them wasn't hard. I knew how to do those things. He paused. I knew how to keep people alive. Grace felt the words settle. Jacob looked toward the dark windows of the house. I didn't know how to make them feel like they weren't waiting for someone else to disappear. Grace said nothing. His hands tightened together. So I kept working. The admission was almost a whisper. Fences. Cattle, hay. Accounts. His mouth pulled slightly to one side. Anything with an answer I could see. Grace understood that too well. Jacob finally looked at her. When you asked me that question in the kitchen, I didn't answer because I didn't know what to do with it. Grace held his gaze. I know, I've been thinking about it. She looked away. Jacob continued. I kept telling myself I was doing right by the boys because they had food and boots and a safe place to sleep. His eyes went toward the upstairs windows. But then you came here, and Eli started laughing at supper. Grace said nothing. Adam started sitting at the table after he finished eating. Jacob's hands loosened. Molly asks me questions like I'm expected to have an answer. Grace smiled faintly. She does that to everyone. I noticed. The smile disappeared from Jacob's face, and I realized I've been standing in this house for years without really being in it. The honesty of it made Grace still. Jacob drew a slow breath. After Daniel and Rebecca, I decided needing people was another way of giving death something to take. Grace's fingers curled beneath the sleeves of her wrapper. There it was. Not the answer she had asked for. Something beneath it. Something older. She looked out into the falling snow. My husband died in 4 days, she said. Jacob turned. Grace rarely spoke of William beyond a sentence here or there. He went to work on a Monday morning. Her voice remained even. By Monday night, he was shaking. She rubbed her thumb against her palm. Friday morning, I was a widow. Jacob said nothing. Molly was 7. Grace swallowed. I spent the next year making sure she never saw me frightened. Her eyes stayed on the yard. Then I spent the next 3 convincing myself I had succeeded. Jacob watched her. Grace gave a small, humorless smile. I hadn't. The snow thickened. She drew the wrapper tighter around herself. I suppose we did the same thing. Jacob frowned slightly. You stopped letting yourself need people. Grace looked at him. And I stopped expecting anyone to choose me. The words hung between them. Jacob's face changed. Not dramatically. Just enough. He shifted slightly toward her. Grace noticed. She did not move away. His large hand rested on the porch step between them. Hers lay in her lap. The distance between those hands was less than a foot. Neither crossed it. Jacob looked at her. Grace met his eyes. For a few seconds, there was no contract. No kitchen. No ranch. No questions waiting for answers. Only 2 people sitting beneath a porch roof while snow erased the yard beyond them. Jacob's lips parted. A sudden pounding of hooves broke the quiet. Both turned. A horse came hard through the gate. Grace stood. Jacob was already moving. The rider bent low over the saddle, coat flapping behind him. Jacob! The horse slid near the hitching rail. Jacob caught the bridle. The rider nearly fell dismounting. It was Pete Lawson. His face was pale beneath windburn. What happened? Pete struggled for breath. North Line. Jacob's expression changed. What? Reeves and Collins. Grace stepped down from the porch. What about them? Pete looked from Jacob to her. Both went down. Jacob's hand tightened around the bridle. Down how? Fever. Grace went still. Pete swallowed. Bad. A light appeared upstairs. Then another. The house was waking. Jacob turned toward Grace. Whatever had been forming between them on the porch vanished beneath something colder. Practical. Immediate. Dangerous. Grace was already moving toward the door. Get them here. Jacob looked at her. Already the bunkhouse. Pete climbed back into the saddle. Jacob grabbed his coat from inside the doorway and followed. Grace caught his sleeve. He turned. For 1 second, their eyes met. Everything unfinished remained there. She released him. Bring them back alive. Jacob nodded. Then he disappeared into the snow. Grace stood in the doorway, listening to the horses race north until the sound faded. Behind her, Molly came down the stairs carrying a lamp. What happened? Grace turned toward the kitchen. Put water on to boil. Something in her voice made Molly stop asking questions. Grace tied on her apron. Outside, the quiet snow kept falling, and before dawn, Pine Hollow would begin fighting something far more dangerous than anything Grace and Jacob had been afraid to say. Pete Lawson returned first. He came through the gate shortly before 2 a.m, with Tom Reeves slumped against him in the saddle and another ranch hand leading Ben Collins's horse close behind. Jacob rode beside them. Snow covered his shoulders. Open the bunkhouse. Grace already had. She and Molly had stripped 4 cots, carried in clean quilts, and filled every kettle they could find. 2 lamps burned from hooks overhead. The stove glowed red along one seam. Jacob lifted Reeves down himself. The sick man tried to stand. His knees folded. Jacob caught him before he touched the ground. Easy, I can walk. No, you can't. There was no argument after that. Grace pulled back a blanket. Here. Jacob lowered Reeves onto the cot. Ben Collins came next, shivering so violently his teeth clicked together. His face was flushed dark with fever, but his fingers felt cold when Grace took his hand. How long? Pete pulled off his hat. Reeves complained yesterday afternoon. Collins after supper. Cough, both. Vomiting. Reeves did. Grace looked toward Jacob. Send somebody for Dr. Hayes. I already sent Frank. Good. She dipped a cloth into warm water. Molly, go back to the house. Molly hesitated. I can help. You can help by keeping Adam and Eli upstairs. Mother, please. That word settled it. Molly nodded and left. Jacob watched Grace move between the cots. No wasted steps, no raised voice. She asked questions, checked foreheads, changed damp shirts, and marked the time on a scrap of paper with a pencil stub. Reeves tried water. He brought it back up minutes later. Grace waited, then tried again with a spoon, a little at a time. By sunrise, a third man was coughing. By noon, there were 5. Dr. Walter Hayes arrived through blowing snow with his medicine case tied beneath his coat. He stepped inside, took one look at the cots, and swore softly. Who started first? Grace handed him the paper. Reeves, then Collins. Pete started coughing just after daylight. Daniel Price has chills, but no stomach trouble yet. Mr. Boone says his head aches. Walter looked at her. You wrote all this? I needed to remember. He nodded once. Keep doing it. That was how the next 3 days began, and almost ended. The snow deepened until the North Road vanished entirely. Walter stayed at Pine Hollow because traveling back and forth became foolish. The bunkhouse filled. Not every man became seriously ill, but enough did that the ranch changed shape around them. The healthy hands worked shorter shifts. Meals came at odd hours. Buckets of water moved constantly between the kitchen and bunkhouse. The ranch office became a place to dry blankets. Grace stopped caring what time it was. Her day was measured differently. Who had swallowed? Who had vomited? Who had slept? Who had not? Who had urinated? Who had become confused? Who was suddenly too quiet? She marked each change beside a name. Walter began asking for the list before he opened his medicine case. Price? 2 cups of water since midnight. Half a bowl of broth. Fever still high. Boone? Better. Asked for bread. Don't give it yet. I wasn't planning to. Walter glanced at her. Reeves? Grace's mouth tightened. Nothing stayed down until 4 this morning. And after? 6 spoonfuls. Water? Broth. Walter nodded. Keep it slow. The stockpot never left the stove. Grace roasted beef bones first when she could, then simmered them with onion, carrot, barley, salt, and whatever vegetables remained sound in the cellar. Nothing fancy, nothing wasted. Sometimes she thinned it. Sometimes she skimmed the fat for a stomach too weak to handle it. Mostly she sat beside cots and waited. 1 spoon, then another, then another. Jacob watched her do it without fully understanding why. He had more immediate problems. Cattle still needed hay. Ice had to be broken from troughs. The south gate blew loose. 2 healthy men were covering work normally done by 6. Jacob slept perhaps 3 hours in 4 days. He moved between barn, bunkhouse, and house with the rigid endurance of a man who believed stopping would permit something worse to catch him. Grace hardly spoke to him. There was no room for what had happened between them on the porch. Sometimes their eyes met across the bunkhouse. That was all. Then Eli coughed at breakfast. Grace heard it from the kitchen. One cough. Dry. Small. She froze with the ladle in her hand. Eli looked up from his oatmeal. What? Grace crossed the room. She touched his forehead. Warm. Jacob saw her expression. No. Grace looked at him. Jacob. No. The word came harder. He was sick 2 weeks ago. He's not. Eli coughed again. Jacob stopped speaking. Walter examined him within the hour. By afternoon, Eli was in bed. By evening, the fever climbed. Grace moved him into the bunkhouse only after Walter decided it was easier to keep every sick person where he could watch them. Jacob objected. He stays in the house. Walter did not look up from cleaning his thermometer. And when his breathing changes while I'm out here? Jacob's jaw tightened. He stays where I can reach him, Walter said. That ended it. Grace placed Eli's cot near the stove, the same place where Jacob would stand weeks later, remembering every careless word he had ever spoken to her. Eli was weaker this time. He refused food, then water. Grace sat beside him. 1 spoon. He turned his face away. No. I know, my stomach hurts. I know, I don't want it. Grace blew across the broth. You don't have to want it. Jacob stood behind her. Those words sounded familiar. Eli swallowed. Grace waited, then offered another. By midnight, the boy had taken less than half a cup. Jacob paced. Walter told him twice to sit down. Jacob ignored him. At one point, Grace reached for the bowl again. Jacob's voice cut across the room. Enough. Grace looked up. He needs another. He needs medicine. Walter gave him medicine. He needs something stronger than this. Grace's fingers tightened around the spoon. Jacob. For days he had watched men shake beneath blankets, watched cattle go unfed until noon, watched his ranch thin itself to the bone. Now his nephew lay pale before him. Something in him broke loose. You can't fight this with soup. The spoon stopped. Only for half a second. Grace looked at him. No anger. That would have been easier. She simply turned back to Eli. Open your mouth, sweetheart. Walter, 3 cots away, straightened. What did you say? Jacob dragged both hands through his hair. I said the boy needs more than broth. Walter crossed the bunkhouse. He's getting everything I have that I believe will help him. Then why is he worse? Because he's sick. Jacob's face hardened. That isn't an answer. It is the only honest one. Walter pointed toward Reeves. That man couldn't hold water yesterday. Then toward Collins. He was too weak to sit up. His fingers shifted toward Grace. She got fluid into both of them. Jacob said nothing. Walter's voice stayed low, but every word carried. Do you think she's stirring miracles into that pot? She isn't. Grace lifted another spoon to Eli's lips. Walter continued. She is giving them something their bodies can tolerate. Water, salt, a little nourishment. And she is doing it slowly enough that half of them keep it down. Jacob's eyes went toward the pot. It is broth. Yes. Walter stepped closer. And when a sick man won't drink a cup, she gives him a spoon. When he can't manage a bowl, she gives him 6 mouthfuls and returns an hour later. The wind rattled the shutters. Nobody nearby spoke. Walter looked directly at Jacob. Medicine doesn't do much for a man who is too dried out and weak to survive his own fever. Jacob's shoulders lowered slightly. Walter pointed toward the rows of cots. Several men here are stronger tonight, because she has spent 3 days doing the work nobody sees. Grace wiped Eli's mouth. Walter's voice softened. Call it nothing special if you like. Jacob went completely still. Grace did too. The doctor had no idea. But Jacob did. So did Grace. Walter nodded toward the stockpot. It's helping keep these men alive long enough for me to do my part. Silence settled over the bunkhouse. Jacob looked at Grace. Weeks earlier, she had stood beside his table waiting for his judgment. It's good. Nothing special, but good. Now she sat before him in a wrinkled dress, hair falling loose, eyes shadowed from exhaustion, feeding his nephew with the same patience she had given every hired hand on the ranch. She did not look victorious. She did not look at Jacob at all. That made it worse. Eli swallowed. Grace touched his forehead. Good. Jacob stepped closer. Grace. She dipped the spoon again. What? He tried to speak. Nothing came quickly enough. The old failure, the same silence. Grace finally looked at him. Whatever she saw made her expression soften only a fraction. Not forgiveness. Not yet. Hold the lamp, she said. Jacob took it. He raised it over her shoulder. For the next hour, that was all he did. He held the lamp while Grace fed Eli. When her arm trembled from fatigue, Jacob noticed. He set the lamp on its hook and knelt beside her. Give me the bowl. Grace hesitated. You know how? No. The answer was immediate. Show me. She looked at him, then placed the bowl in his enormous hand. Small spoonful. Jacob filled the spoon too high. Grace shook her head. Less. He poured some back. Wait after he swallows. Jacob nodded. He brought the spoon toward Eli. His hand was steady with ropes, rifles, tools, reins. It shook now. Eli opened his eyes. Uncle Jacob? Yeah. You look scared. Jacob swallowed. I am. The boy stared at him as if he had never heard such a thing before. Grace did too. Jacob lifted the spoon. Can you take this? Eli opened his mouth, swallowed. Jacob waited exactly as Grace had told him, then prepared another. Grace remained beside them, close enough that her sleeve touched his arm. Neither moved away. Outside, snow continued burying the valley. Inside, the giant cowboy who had spent years believing strength meant knowing what to do learned something different beside a sick child's bed. Sometimes strength was admitting that you did not know, and trusting the person beside you enough to let her show you. Jacob learned that lesson slowly through the rest of the night. Eli took 6 more spoonfuls, then 4, then none. Near 2 in the morning, the boy turned his face away and did not answer when Grace spoke his name. Jacob stood so quickly the chair scraped across the floor. Walter. Dr. Hayes was already moving. He came from the far cot, set down his mug, and bent over Eli with 2 fingers at the boy's wrist. Grace shifted back just enough to give him room. Jacob did not. He stood over the cot like a wall. Walter listened to Eli's chest, waited, listened again. His breathings shallower. Jacob's jaw locked. What do we do? Keep him warm. Keep trying fluids when he wakes. When he wakes? Walter looked up. He's sleeping, Jacob. That isn't what you said. Walter straightened. What do you want me to say? Jacob stared at him. Walter's face softened. I'll stay close. That was all the promise he could honestly give. Jacob hated him for it for nearly half a second. Then he hated himself. Grace pulled another blanket over Eli. The boy looked impossibly small beneath it. The bunkhouse had finally quieted. A few of the men slept. Others breathed heavily in the dark. The stove clicked as iron cooled between feedings of wood. Jacob sat again, this time closer to the cot. Grace stayed on the other side. Hours seemed to lose their shape. Sometimes Eli stirred. Sometimes he did not. Every few minutes, Jacob leaned forward and watched the boy's chest. Rise, fall, rise, fall. Grace noticed the pattern. At first, she said nothing. Then, after the fourth or fifth time, she whispered, "He's breathing." Jacob kept watching. "I know." Another rise, another fall. Grace folded her hands in her lap. "You don't have to check every 10 seconds. "Yes, I do." There was something in his voice that made her turn. Jacob's face had changed. Not the hard expression she had seen during storms or arguments. This was older. He looked at the child as if another room had opened inside this one, and only he could see it. Grace spoke softly. "Jacob." His eyes stayed on Eli. "My brother died before I got there." She went still. He had told her part of it on the porch. Not like this. Jacob rubbed both hands down his thighs. "I knew Daniel was sick." His voice barely carried over the stove. "Rebecca sent word." He swallowed. "I was north buying cattle. Could have turned around the first day." Grace did not interrupt. He'd had fevers before. Jacob's mouth tightened. "I told myself I'd finish the deal and ride back the next morning." His eyes never left Eli. The next morning became afternoon because one of the horses threw a shoe. He breathed in through his nose. By the time I got home, there were sheets over the windows. Grace looked down. Jacob's hands closed. I walked into the bedroom and Rebecca was sitting beside him. His voice cracked on the last word. Not loudly, barely, but Grace heard it. She said he kept asking when I'd get there. Jacob stopped. The silence stretched. Grace could hear snow brushing the outside wall. "He died before I crossed the yard." Jacob's hand pressed against his mouth. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he continued. "Rebecca held on for months." His eyes shut. "I thought I could keep her alive if I just did enough." Grace recognized the sentence before he finished it. More wood, better food, a doctor from Red Creek, another blanket, another medicine. He gave a short breath that held no humor. "Everything I could carry, buy, build, or fix." Grace looked at Eli, and none of it stopped what happened. Jacob shook his head. When she died, Adam didn't cry. His voice lowered. He stood beside the table and asked where he was supposed to sleep now. Grace's fingers tightened together. Eli kept asking when his mother was coming back. Jacob stared at his nephew. "I didn't know what to tell them." "So you gave them a home?" "I gave them a building." Grace looked at him. Jacob finally turned toward her. His eyes were wet. He did not hide it. "I kept them fed." "Yes." "Kept them clothed." "Yes." "Kept them safe." "Yes." His voice dropped, and thought that was enough. Grace did not answer. Jacob looked back at Eli. "Because if I admitted it wasn't, then I'd have to admit there were things I couldn't protect." The words came slowly now, unevenly. "And if I let myself love them like Daniel did, then every cough, every fall off a horse, Every late rider coming through that gate. His huge hands began to shake. Grace saw it. Jacob saw it too. He stared down at them as if they belonged to somebody else. I thought if I stayed useful enough, I wouldn't have to be afraid. Grace's breath caught. The same word. Useful. Her own shield, reflected back at her from another direction. Jacob laughed once under his breath. Small. Broken. Turns out I was afraid the whole time. Grace reached across the space between them. She did not think about it first. Both her hands closed around one of his. Jacob froze. His hand was large enough to swallow both of hers, yet it trembled inside them. Grace held on. Nothing more. No speech. No reassurance she could not prove. Just warmth. Jacob bowed his head. His forehead touched the back of her hand. Grace stopped breathing for a second. He did not kiss it. Did not turn the moment into something else. He simply rested there. Exhausted. Grace's thumb moved once across his knuckles. I'm here. Jacob closed his eyes. That was enough. For a while. Near 4, Eli stirred. Grace felt Jacob's hand tense inside hers. They both turned. The boy's eyelids fluttered. Water. Jacob stood so fast he almost knocked over the chair. Grace reached for the cup. Slow. Eli drank 2 small swallows. Then another. Walter appeared at the foot of the cot, hair wild from sleep. He checked the boy's forehead, then his pulse, then waited. Jacob stared at him. Well? Walter gave him a tired look. You're going to wear a hole through me with those eyes. Walter. The doctor touched Eli's forehead again. Fever's easing. Jacob did not move. Grace looked at Walter. Are you sure? Not gone. Walter straightened, but lower. Jacob sat down. Not gracefully. His knees seemed to give way at once. Grace caught his shoulder. He covered her hand with his. Neither spoke. The relief was too fresh for celebration, too fragile. They sat through the last dark hour before dawn, listening to Eli breathe. Not counting now. Just listening. When pale light finally crept between the shutters, one of the recovering ranch hands pushed himself upright and asked whether there was coffee. Walter swore at him. Grace laughed. It slipped out before she could stop it. Jacob looked at her. The sound did something to his face. For 1 second, all the exhaustion softened. Eli slept on, alive, breathing easier. Jacob still held Grace's hand against his shoulder. He seemed to realize it at the same moment she did. Neither moved. Then hoofbeats sounded outside. Fast. Too fast for an ordinary morning rider. Jacob released her and stood. Walter frowned toward the door. The hoofbeats stopped sharply in the yard. A man's voice shouted, "Dawson!" Jacob crossed the bunkhouse in 3 strides and pulled the door open. Cold air rushed inside. A rider from Cedar Run Ranch sat on a lathered bay horse, his hat tied beneath his chin, snow crusted along his coat. Jacob stepped into the doorway. What happened? The rider glanced past him at the rows of sick men, then back. Turner's sent me. Grace came closer. Jacob's expression hardened at the name. What does Frank want? The rider took a breath. Your cattle broke the west boundary sometime in the night. Jacob went still. How many? Enough. What does that mean? They got into Cedar Run's winter hay. Jacob's face changed. The rider continued quickly. Turner says they're still pushing through. Claims they've torn up near half the stored stacks by the lower field. That fence was sound. Not anymore. Jacob stepped outside. Grace followed to the porch. Snow had stopped. The morning sky was pale and mercilessly clear. The rider shifted in the saddle. Turner says he'll be in Red Creek by tomorrow to file damages. Jacob's hand closed around the porch rail. How much? The rider hesitated. He didn't give a figure. That was worse. Jacob looked toward the white hills beyond the ranch. Only hours earlier, he had sat beside Eli's bed, believing the worst thing Pine Hollow could lose was a child. Now someone had found another way to strike, while half his men could barely stand. Grace watched his face settle back into the hard control she knew. Jacob. He looked at her. Don't ride angry. His jaw tightened. I need to see the fence. Yes. And the cattle. Yes. Grace held his eyes. But see before you decide. Jacob said nothing. Then he nodded once. He went inside for his coat. Grace remained on the porch as the Cedar Run rider turned his horse. Behind her, Eli was sleeping. Ahead of her, Jacob's ranch waited beneath the snow, with a broken boundary and a neighbor already calculating what it might cost him. The fever had not finished with Pine Hollow yet. But something else had been waiting for weakness. And it had chosen this morning to show its hand. Jacob left Pine Hollow before breakfast with Adam, Pete Lawson, and 2 of the men strong enough to sit a saddle. Grace watched them ride west, beneath a sky so clear it made the cold seem sharper. The previous night's snow lay untouched across the fields, except where horses had broken through it. Sunlight flashed from the drifts. Smoke rose straight from the bunkhouse chimney. Behind Grace, someone coughed. She turned. There was still work here. Dr. Hayes had 3 men improving and 2 he wanted watched closely. Eli's fever remained lower, but he slept more than Grace liked. The doctor said sleep was not the enemy. Grace believed him. She also checked the boy every 20 minutes. By noon, Jacob had not returned. Grace moved between kitchen and bunkhouse with the supply ledger tucked beneath one arm. Flour, salt, barley, dried beans, lamp oil, beef, firewood. The numbers had become more important during the sickness because every trip into Red Creek was uncertain. She had begun marking not only what they used, but who carried it out and when. It was a habit learned from hard years. If you had little, you learned where every little thing went. Molly sat at the kitchen table copying lessons while Eli slept upstairs. You've checked the road 6 times, she said. Grace set a sack of barley onto the scale. 5. 6. Grace ignored her. Molly smiled faintly and went back to her book. Jacob returned shortly after 3. Grace heard the horses before she saw them. Not running, walking hard, tired. She stepped onto the porch. Jacob dismounted without waiting for anyone to take his reins. His coat was crusted with snow and dried mud. Adam came down behind him, face pale with cold. Grace looked at Jacob. Well, the fence is down. Broken? Jacob pulled off one glove with his teeth. Cut. Grace went still. Adam looked toward her. Jacob continued. 3 sections. Wire loosened at the braces. 2 posts pulled enough that cattle pushing against them finished the rest. Could weather have done it? No. His answer came flat. Certain. Pete led the horses toward the barn. Jacob stood in the yard looking west. Turner's men drove most of our cattle back this morning. That was decent of them. Jacob's mouth hardened. Turner charged me for the labor. Grace said nothing. Jacob removed his other glove. He also counted every damaged haystack while I stood there. How bad? Bad enough. Grace waited. Jacob looked at her. Maybe worse. They went inside. He spread a rough map across the dining table, holding the corners down with a coffee mug, a salt cellar, and one of Eli's wooden checkers. Grace stood opposite him. Adam remained near the doorway. Jacob pointed at the western boundary. Cattle crossed here. His finger moved. Turner's claiming they reached 3 hay lots. How much hay? He says 40 tons damaged. Grace looked up. All by cattle? He says. You believe him? No. Jacob did not hesitate. But proving otherwise is different. The kitchen door opened. Dr. Hayes came in carrying his medicine case. What's happened? Jacob explained. Walter listened without interrupting. When Jacob finished, he let out a long breath. Turner knows half your men are sick. Yes. Convenient. Yes. A wagon sounded outside. This time no one moved immediately. Then Jacob's expression changed. That's not ours. He went to the window. A black cutter stopped in front of the house. Frank Turner stepped down. He was a medium-sized man, perhaps 40, with a trimmed mustache and a dark buffalo coat. He brushed snow from one sleeve before climbing the porch as though arriving for supper. Jacob opened the door before he could knock. Turner. Dawson. Frank glanced into the room. Mrs. Miller. Doctor. Grace did not return the greeting. Frank removed his gloves. I figured we'd save ourselves a trip into Red Creek. Jacob remained in the doorway. Say what you came to say. Turner's eyes moved once toward the table. Your cattle destroyed a winter's worth of feed. How much? Enough to cost me dearly. Number. Turner smiled without warmth. $2,000. Adam sucked in a breath. Grace's eyes went to Jacob. $2,000 in winter could break a smaller ranch. Pine Hollow was not small, but the sickness had already cost time, wages, supplies, and cattle weight. Jacob's voice remained level. You know that figure is nonsense. Turner shrugged. Then we can have the court decide. What do you actually want? That smile returned. Grace understood before he said it. The Western Tract. Jacob went perfectly still. Turner placed his gloves on the table. Sign over the sheltered grazing lease through next winter, and I'll settle the damages without cash. Walter muttered something under his breath. Jacob took one step forward. The entire room seemed to tighten around his size. Turner stopped smiling. Grace watched Jacob's right hand curl. Jacob. He did not look at her. Frank's voice lowered. Think carefully. Grace moved closer to Jacob. Not in front of him. Beside him. Don't. His jaw flexed. Turner looked at her. This is ranch business, Mrs. Miller. Grace met his eyes. You came into the house where I work, while men I've been helping nurse are still sick because your demand could take winter supplies away from them. She folded her hands. You made it my business. Turner's eyes sharpened. Jacob looked down at her. The anger in his face did not disappear, but it settled. He stepped back. Get out, Turner. Frank picked up his gloves. You have until Monday. Jacob said nothing. Turner pulled them on slowly. Then he turned toward Grace. For someone hired to cook, you've developed strong opinions. Grace smiled politely. For someone asking $2,000, you've brought remarkably little paper. Turner's face went blank. Walter coughed to hide a laugh. Frank left. The cutter bells faded down the road. Jacob stared at the closed door. I should have broken his nose. Then he would have had 2 claims against you. Jacob looked at Grace. I know. That answer surprised her. He dragged a hand across his face. I still wanted to. I know that too. Adam finally spoke. The fence was cut. Jacob turned. Yes. Then somebody did it. Yes. Adam hesitated. Grace noticed. What? The boy looked toward the table. Nothing. Adam. He rubbed one thumb over the other. I saw Roy by the supply shed. Jacob's expression changed. When? The night before the storm. Roy Jenkins? Adam nodded. He said he was looking for a lantern. Grace frowned. Roy was sick that night. He said he was. Jacob looked toward the bunkhouse. Where is he now? With the East cattle, Adam said. He went back to work yesterday. Grace's attention shifted. Wait. She crossed to the pantry. Jacob followed. Grace opened the cupboard where hardware supplies were kept temporarily during winter. Nails, hinges, leather straps, 2 small coils of wire. She stopped. Jacob stood behind her. What? Grace touched the empty space on the shelf. There should be another coil. You're sure? Yes. How? Because Ben brought 3 in from the freight wagon before the sickness started. Grace went to the table and opened her ledger. Pages of figures, dates, marks. She turned back 4 sheets. Here. Jacob leaned over her shoulder. His size blocked the lamplight. Grace pointed. 3 coils received on January 28th. How many used? 1 on the south calf pen. She turned another page. Nothing else recorded. Jacob stared. Grace tapped the line. 2 should still be there. There are 2, no. She looked at him. There were 3. After the south pen repair. Jacob straightened slowly. 1 coil missing. Adam swallowed. I saw Roy carrying something under his coat that night. Jacob looked toward him. What kind of something? I don't know. Molly had entered quietly from the hall. Grace saw her face. Molly? The girl stopped. She had that expression she wore when deciding whether something mattered. Say it. Molly looked at Jacob. I saw Roy talking to a man near the creek. When? Maybe a week before everyone got sick. Jacob's voice sharpened. What man? I don't know. She twisted the edge of her sleeve. He had Cedar Run's mark on his saddle blanket. The room became silent. Grace closed the ledger. What did they do? Molly thought. The man gave Roy something. Money? I couldn't see. Tobacco, maybe. Jacob looked toward the west window. Grace could almost see the old instinct rising again. Horse. Rifle. Turner. She put one hand over the ledger. Evidence first. Jacob looked at her. We have a missing coil and children who saw things. And cut wire still at the fence? Yes. Bring it. Jacob's eyes narrowed slightly. Grace continued. If Roy used Pine Hollow wire to weaken Pine Hollow's fence, some of that cut wire may still be there. Walter nodded slowly. Deputy Reed can question him. Jacob looked toward the door. Grace stepped closer. You ride to Turner now, he'll deny everything. I know. If you're wrong, I know. And if you're right, anger will warn him. Jacob turned back toward her. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he reached for the map. Adam, saddle 2 horses. Grace blinked. 2? Jacob looked directly at her. You're coming. I am? You found the missing wire. That doesn't require me to ride to Red Creek. No. His expression shifted. But I nearly solved this with my fists. Grace waited. Jacob picked up her ledger carefully. I'd rather have the person who stopped me standing nearby when I explain why. Grace looked at him. Something warm moved beneath all the fear and exhaustion. Not romance exactly. Something sturdier. Trust. Within 20 minutes, they were ready. Adam wrapped the recovered section of cut boundary wire in burlap and tied it behind Jacob's saddle. Grace tucked her ledger inside her coat, where snow could not reach it. Molly stood on the porch. Be careful. Grace kissed her forehead. You stay with Dr. Hayes. Jacob mounted, then looked down at Grace. He offered his hand, the same way he had outside Parker's store weeks earlier. No assumption, just an offer. Grace placed her hand in his. He helped her into the saddle of a chestnut mare. The road toward Red Creek was already losing light. Snow clouds gathered above the western ridge. Jacob turned his horse toward the gate. Grace rode beside him, not behind. Behind them, Pine Hollow still carried sickness in its rooms. Ahead waited a deputy, a frightened hired hand, and a neighbor who had counted on Jacob Dawson becoming angry before he became suspicious. Turner's mistake was simple. He had expected the giant cowboy to notice only the broken fence. He had not counted on Grace Miller noticing what was missing from the shelf. The ride to Red Creek took longer than usual because the road had iced beneath fresh snow. Jacob kept his horse a little ahead on the steepest stretches, then slowed again whenever Grace's mare picked carefully through ruts frozen hard as iron. Neither spoke much. There was too much to think about. The burlap-wrapped section of cut wire knocked lightly against Jacob's saddle with every step. Grace kept one hand inside her coat, pressed against the ledger tucked there. The book felt strangely heavy, not because of its size, because of what it might prove. By the time the first roofs of Red Creek appeared through the gray afternoon, lamps were already burning in the windows. Deputy Charles Reed's office stood beside the land clerk's building near the end of Main Street. A blue enamel coffee pot sat on the little stove inside. 2 rifles hung from pegs on the wall. A stack of notices, receipts, and territorial forms leaned beneath a paperweight made from a horseshoe. Charles Reed looked up when Jacob ducked through the doorway. He was a narrow man with iron-gray whiskers and a habit of taking off his spectacles before asking serious questions. Dawson, Charles. The deputy looked past him. Mrs. Miller. Grace nodded. We need to talk. Charles leaned back. Usually when a man your size opens with that, I reach for the handcuffs. Jacob did not smile. Charles stopped joking. What happened? Grace placed the ledger on his desk. Jacob set the burlap bundle beside it. Charles removed his spectacles. 20 minutes later, he was no longer sitting. He stood beside the stove holding a cut length of wire between 2 fingers. This from your boundary? Yes, Jacob said. And you're certain the fence didn't fail from weather? I built the braces myself. That wasn't my question. Jacob's jaw shifted. No. It was cut. Charles looked at Grace. And the missing supply? She opened the ledger. 3 coils received January 28th. Her finger followed a pencil mark. 1 used on the south calf pen 2 days later. And 2 remain? Yes. Charles frowned. That accounts for 3. Grace shook her head. No. 3 remained after the calf pen repair. She turned back 1 page. The freight receipt shows 4 coils delivered, not 3. I copied the first total wrong into my pantry count, then corrected it beside the entry. Charles leaned closer. A small mark appeared in the margin. 4 received. 1 used. 3 stored. 2 now on the shelf. Charles looked up. So one is missing. Yes. Jacob glanced at Grace. Even he had not caught the correction until now. Charles asked, "Who had access?" "Anyone working Pine Hollow," Jacob said. Grace added, "But Adam saw Roy Jenkins near the supply shed the night before the storm. And Roy later said he was sick?" "Yes." Charles rubbed one thumb along his jaw. "You got Roy with you?" "No." Jacob's voice tightened. "He's back at Pine Hollow." Charles looked at him over the top of his spectacles. "And you came here first instead of going after him?" Jacob's eyes flicked toward Grace. "Yes." Charles noticed. He did not comment. "Good." Jacob seemed mildly offended by the surprise. Charles returned his spectacles to his face. "I'll ride out with you." Grace looked toward the window. "It'll be dark before we get back. Then we'll ride in the dark." Charles reached for his coat. They returned to Pine Hollow shortly after 8. The house lights were visible from half a mile away. Inside, Dr. Hayes reported Eli had eaten several spoonfuls of oatmeal and demanded to know why nobody had brought him bacon. That alone loosened something in Jacob's shoulders. Then Charles Reed went to the bunkhouse. Roy Jenkins was sitting near the stove playing cards with 2 recovering ranch hands. He looked up. The color left his face almost immediately. Charles saw that too. "Roy." The hired man set his cards down. "Deputy, come talk with me." Roy looked toward Jacob. Jacob stood in the doorway. Grace beside him. "Not behind." Roy gave a nervous laugh. "What about?" "The west fence. I don't know anything about it." Charles had not asked whether he did. The room went quiet. Roy realized his mistake. He looked away. Charles pulled out a chair. "Sit." Roy sat. At first, the questioning went nowhere. He had been sick. He had gone to the supply shed for a lantern. He knew nothing about missing wire. He had never met Frank Turner privately. He certainly had not been paid. Charles listened. Grace listened too. Then Charles laid the cut wire across the table. Roy's eyes moved toward it. Only for a second. "Enough." Grace opened her ledger. Charles tapped the entry. 1 coil missing. Roy shrugged. "Could have been used anywhere." "Maybe." Charles nodded toward Adam, who stood near the rear wall with Molly. "Boy says he saw you near the shed." "Boy sees things." Molly spoke. "I saw you by the creek." Roy turned. The girl continued before anyone stopped her. "You were talking to a Cedar Run rider." Roy laughed. "People talk. He gave you something." The laugh disappeared. Charles leaned back. "What did he give you? Nothing. Then that should be easy to explain." Roy rubbed both hands together. "Was tobacco. What kind?" Roy looked at him. Charles waited. Grace saw the exact moment the lie began to buckle. A man's face changed differently when he was afraid of being blamed than when he was afraid of being found out. Roy looked toward Jacob. The giant rancher had not moved. That seemed to frighten him more than anger would have. "Mr. Dawson." Jacob's voice came low. "Tell the truth." Roy swallowed. "I didn't mean for the cattle to get that far." Nobody spoke. Charles Reed's pencil stopped above his paper. "What did you mean?" Roy stared at the floor. "Turner's man said, 'Just loosen the western stretch.'" Jacob's hands curled once. Grace saw it. Her fingers touched his sleeve. Nothing more. His fist opened. Roy continued. "He said cattle would push through. Turner would claim some hay damage. Make you scared enough of a court fight to give up the lease. How much? Charles asked. Roy looked miserable. $20. Adam stared at him. $20? For a winter range? For damaged cattle? For a ranch already fighting sickness? Jacob's voice was almost too quiet to hear. You did that for $20? Roy looked up. I owed money. So you sold mine. Roy flinched. Charles stepped between the direction of their gazes. Who paid you? Turner's foreman. Turner know? Roy hesitated. Charles waited. Yes. The answer settled over the room. Jacob turned away. Grace watched him walk to the bunkhouse door and stop with one hand against the frame. She knew what it cost him not to go straight to Cedar Run. Charles wrote everything down. Names, dates, amounts. He had Roy sign the statement. Then he folded the paper, placed it inside his coat, and said Turner would answer questions in Red Creek the following morning. Frank Turner arrived before noon. This time he did not come to Pine Hollow. He came to the deputy's office. By 1 o'clock, half of Red Creek seemed to know. Nobody ever understood how news traveled so fast through frontier towns. It simply did. Grace stood inside Parker's general store while Helen measured coffee beans into a paper sack. Molly stood nearby with Eli, who had insisted on coming to town wrapped in 2 scarves. Adam leaned against a shelf, pretending not to listen to anyone. Jacob entered from the street with Charles Reed. The store quieted. Frank Turner had already left through the rear door. His demand for $2,000 had disappeared with him. The grazing claim would not be surrendered. Any legitimate hay damage would be assessed separately. The sabotage would become a matter for the territorial authorities. Someone near the stove slapped Jacob on the shoulder. Saved your ranch, Dawson. Another man laughed. Knew Turner shouldn't have tangled with Big Jacob. Jacob stopped. Grace looked down at the sack in her hands. She knew how this part went. The big man won. The town remembered the big man. People preferred simple stories. Jacob turned toward them. No. The man by the stove blinked. No what? I didn't save it. The room went quiet. Jacob looked across the store. His eyes found Grace. She stopped breathing for half a second. Then he walked toward her. Every bootstep seemed louder than it should have. Grace stood still. Jacob stopped beside her. Not in front. Beside. Mrs. Miller noticed the wire was missing. A man near the counter shifted. Jacob continued. She kept the supply records. His eyes remained on Grace. She listened to the children when the rest of us were ready to dismiss what they'd seen. Grace's throat tightened. Jacob looked around the store. I was ready to ride straight to Turner's place, angry enough to make matters worse. A few men smiled uncomfortably. Jacob did not. She stopped me. Grace looked at him. There was no embarrassment in his face. No performance. Just truth. She paid attention when I didn't. Jacob's voice lowered. That's why Pine Hollow is still ours. Nobody laughed. Nobody made a joke about Grace's cooking. Helen Parker reached beneath the counter and quietly set a coffee mug in front of Grace without asking whether she wanted one. Grace wrapped both hands around it. The warmth helped. A man she recognized from her first week in Red Creek cleared his throat. He had once made the joke about her eating half the biscuits herself. Mrs. Miller. Grace looked at him. He nodded. Fine work. 2 words. Awkward. Late. But real. Grace nodded back. Thank you. Jacob did not look proud of himself for defending her. That mattered too. He had not told the room she was beautiful. He had not asked them to regret overlooking her. He had simply told them what she had done. Exactly. No more, no less. Grace looked at the man who had once called her cooking nothing special. For weeks she had wondered whether Jacob wanted what she could provide. Now, strangely, it was the way he spoke about her usefulness that answered part of the question. He did not claim it as his. He did not turn her work into evidence of his good fortune. He gave it back to her, as hers. Later, outside the store, Jacob held the reins while Molly helped Eli into the wagon. Grace came down the steps. Jacob looked toward her. "You all right?" "Yes." A pause. "You didn't have to do that in there." "I know." Grace almost smiled. "You seem to say that often." "Still true." She stepped closer. "Why did you?" Jacob looked down the street. Snowmelt dripped from the awnings. A wagon creaked near the livery. Finally, he said, "Because they were congratulating the wrong person." Grace watched him. "That bothered you?" "Yes." "Why?" Jacob looked back at her. The answer seemed to come easier this time. "Because I see you." Grace went very still. Jacob did not add anything. He seemed to know enough now to leave a true sentence alone. He offered his hand to help her into the wagon. Grace looked at it, then at him, and placed her hand in his. This time, when he helped her up, she did not release him immediately. Neither did he. For one small moment, Red Creek moved around them while their hands remained joined. Then Molly called from the wagon, "Are we going home?" Grace turned toward her daughter. Home. The word landed differently. Jacob heard it too. Grace looked toward the road leading north, then back at him. "Seems we are." Jacob's fingers tightened once around hers before letting go. The ride back to Pine Hollow began beneath a clearing sky, and for the first time since Grace Miller had arrived with one trunk and a temporary contract, the thought of spring no longer felt like an ending waiting for her. It felt like a question, and Jacob Dawson was finally learning how to answer it. Spring came slowly to Pine Hollow. For weeks, winter refused to leave all at once. Snow pulled back from the south-facing slopes first, exposing dark grass flattened beneath months of cold. Water began running beneath the ice along the creek. Mud returned to the yard. The cattle stopped crowding the windbreaks and spread farther across the lower pasture each morning. By early April, the road to Red Creek had opened enough for regular wagons again. Dr. Walter Hayes returned twice to check the men who had been sick. Eli had recovered completely and used that fact as an argument for being allowed to do anything he pleased. Adam disagreed with nearly all of those arguments. Molly began riding into town twice a week for lessons when the weather allowed, and Grace kept cooking. Breakfast before sunrise, coffee strong enough for the ranch hands, bread cooling near the window, soup or stew at noon, supper after dark. Life had settled into something so ordinary that Grace sometimes caught herself forgetting the arrangement had ever been temporary. Then one morning she opened the drawer beside her bed and found the original paper Jacob had given her in Red Creek. 3 months' wages, room for herself and Molly, employment through the end of winter. The paper had been folded so many times the creases had gone soft. Grace sat on the edge of the bed and read it twice. Outside, a hammer struck somewhere near the barn. Jacob's voice carried across the yard. Then Eli shouted something about a calf. Grace looked toward the window. Spring. Winter was over. That evening, she took the trunk from beneath the bed. Molly found her folding dresses. The girl stopped in the doorway. "What are you doing?" "Packing." Molly stared. "For what?" "Our agreement is finished." Molly's face changed. "Oh." Grace folded another dress. Molly came farther into the room. Did Mr. Dawson ask us to leave? No. Did you tell him we're leaving? Not yet. Do you want to? Grace stopped. Molly waited. That child had inherited too much patience from her father when she wanted a real answer. Grace sat down. I don't know what I want. Molly looked toward the trunk. Yes, you do. Grace gave her a tired look. 11-year-olds should not be this certain about other people's lives. I'm almost 12. That makes it much worse. Molly did not smile. Grace looked down at her hands. I don't want to stay because everyone needs me. Molly was quiet. Grace continued. I need to know there is some reason beyond that. Mr. Dawson looks at you funny. Grace looked up. Molly, he does. That is not evidence. He fixed your boot. That is also not evidence. He started eating breakfast inside instead of taking it to the barn. Molly, he listens when you talk. Grace tried very hard not to smile. Molly crossed her arms. And he nearly walked into a door last week because you had your hair down. Grace stared at her. He did not. He did. Molly Miller. I was there. Grace covered her face with one hand. Molly finally grinned. Then the smile softened. I don't want to leave. Grace lowered her hand. I know. Adam doesn't either. Adam isn't leaving. I meant he doesn't want us to leave. Grace looked toward the connecting door. And Eli? Molly gave her a look. Eli asked if you could adopt him yesterday. Grace laughed before she could stop herself. Then the laughter disappeared. Her eyes stung. Molly came closer and rested her head against Grace's shoulder. Grace wrapped an arm around her. We'll see, she whispered. The trunk remained open overnight. The following morning, Jacob found it. Grace had carried it into the upstairs hallway while changing the bedding. He came up the stairs with a box of nails beneath one arm, stopped on the final step, and stared at the trunk. For a long moment he said nothing. Grace stepped out of her room carrying folded sheets. Jacob looked at her. What is that? She followed his eyes. My trunk, I know what it is. Grace waited. His voice dropped. Why is it out? My contract ended. Jacob went completely still. The box of nails shifted beneath his arm. You're leaving. I haven't said that. You packed. I am preparing. For leaving. For whatever comes next. Jacob set the nails down on the floor. Slowly, Grace held the sheets tighter. He looked toward Molly's room. When? I don't know. Today? No. Tomorrow? Jacob. He stopped. Grace took a breath. I need to know whether you still need a cook for another season. The question sounded deliberately practical. Jacob heard that. His eyes stayed on her face. No. Grace's fingers tightened around the linen. She had expected uncertainty. Perhaps relief. Not that. All right. She looked down. I'll speak to Helen when we go into town. Jacob frowned. What? You said you don't need a cook. I don't. Grace looked at him. Something in his expression had changed. He stepped closer. Grace, cooks can be hired. She said nothing. Ranch hands can be hired. His voice remained low. Meals can be made by somebody else. Grace's eyes lifted. Jacob continued. A house can stand without you. Each sentence struck strangely. He took another step. But I don't want it to. The hallway became very quiet. From outside came the distant lowing of cattle and the ring of a hammer. Grace's lips parted. Jacob looked toward the trunk, then back at her. I spent half the winter thinking I needed you because the boys needed you. Grace said nothing. I told myself the ranch worked better because you were here. He swallowed. All true. Grace's face stayed guarded. Jacob nodded slightly. I know. He understood now. The practical reasons were not enough. He reached up and removed his hat. Inside the house, a small gesture. Grace noticed. You asked me something once, he said. Her hands loosened around the sheets. I remember. Jacob looked directly at her. If you couldn't cook tomorrow. Grace's breath caught. If you couldn't nurse anybody. He stepped closer. If you never fixed another thing in this house. Grace stood completely still. Jacob's voice softened. I'd still want you here. She looked at him for a long moment. Why? He let out a slow breath. Because I miss you when you're only across the yard. Grace's eyes dropped. Jacob continued before courage failed him. Because I hear you laugh in the kitchen and find reasons to walk through it. Her mouth trembled. Because when something happens, good or bad, you're the person I look for. He paused. And because when I thought you might leave, I didn't worry about who would make supper. Grace looked up. Jacob's eyes held hers. I worried about the house going quiet again. The sheets in Grace's arms suddenly felt too heavy. She set them on the trunk. What if I brought nothing? Jacob did not hesitate this time. Then bring nothing. Her eyes filled. She hated that. She blinked hard. Jacob stayed where he was. No reaching, no rescuing her from the moment. Grace stepped closer. If I couldn't work? I'd still ask. If I got sick? I'd stay. If I became difficult? The corner of his mouth moved. You already are. Grace stared at him. Jacob's eyes warmed. She laughed through the tears she had failed to stop. That was a dangerous answer. I know. Grace wiped one cheek. Then she asked the hardest version. If I brought nothing to Pine Hollow except myself, would you still want me here? Jacob's face became serious again. He looked at her with the same care he had used the first time he offered his hand outside Parker's store. That's the woman I've been trying to ask. Grace stopped breathing. Jacob stepped closer. Slowly. He was so much larger than she was that he had to bend slightly, even standing a foot away. For years, Grace had hated the feeling of taking up too much room. Beside Jacob Dawson, for the first time, that thought did not come. He did not make her feel smaller. He made the space around her feel large enough. Jacob's gaze dropped briefly to her mouth, then returned to her eyes. Grace, yes? May I kiss you? Her heart beat once, hard, then again. She studied him, this giant, stubborn man who had taken half a winter to answer one question. You've taken your time. Jacob almost smiled. Grace caught the front of his shirt with one hand, then pulled him the remaining distance. The kiss was gentle, almost careful enough to make her laugh. Jacob's hand came to her waist, stopped there, and waited. Grace leaned closer. That was answer enough. When they finally parted, Jacob kept his forehead against hers. Neither spoke. Then a small voice came from the staircase. Finally. Grace closed her eyes. Jacob slowly turned. Eli stood 3 steps below them. Molly was behind him. Adam behind her. Grace stared. How long have you been standing there? Eli considered. Long enough. Adam covered his face. Molly looked delighted. Jacob pointed toward the stairs. Outside. Eli grinned. All of us? Yes. Why? Now. They vanished downward in a storm of boots and laughter. Grace looked at Jacob. He sighed. I'll never hear the end of this. No. She smiled. You won't. Months later, Pine Hollow's supper table had become too crowded for silence. Summer evening light filled the windows. Adam argued with Molly over a geography lesson. Eli tried convincing Walter Hayes that 12 was old enough to own a horse nobody else was allowed to ride. Walter informed him that 12 was not old enough to make coffee without ruining it. 3 ranch hands joined the argument. Jacob sat at the head of the table. Grace stood beside the stove ladling stew. Walter took a bite. His eyebrows rose. Grace, this may be the best thing you've made since winter. Jacob's spoon stopped halfway to his mouth. Grace looked toward him. Everyone else noticed. Jacob tasted the stew slowly. Far too slowly. Then he leaned back. Nothing special. The room died. Completely. Adam stared at him. Molly's mouth fell open. Walter looked horrified. Eli whispered, Uncle Jacob. Grace put down the ladle. Very carefully. Jacob's expression remained solemn. Grace reached for the dish towel. His mouth twitched. That betrayed him. You. Jacob grinned. The table exploded. Eli nearly fell from his chair laughing. Molly covered her mouth. Walter struck the table with one hand. Grace threw the towel. Jacob caught it against his chest. Still good, he said. You'll be sleeping in the barn. Worth it. Grace tried to glare at him. She lasted 3 seconds. Then she laughed. Not the careful little laugh she once used in Red Creek. Not the one she swallowed when men made jokes, and she decided her dignity was worth more than answering. This one filled the dining room, filled the kitchen, filled the old log house that had once heard little more than plates, boots, and doors closing. Jacob watched her. Grace caught him. This time neither looked away. Outside, evening wind moved through green grass where snow had once buried the fences. Inside, nobody needed Grace to earn her chair. Nobody needed Jacob to prove his strength. The stew disappeared. Coffee was poured. Conversation moved from one subject to the next. Under the table, Jacob reached across the space between their chairs. His hand found Grace's. She looked at him. He kept talking to Walter as though nothing had happened. Grace smiled. Then she left her hand exactly where he could find it. And maybe that was the quiet miracle of Pine Hollow. Not the ranch surviving winter. Not the broth that kept sick men drinking when their bodies could take little else. It was 2 wounded people finally learning they didn't have to earn the right to be loved. Imagine yourself in Grace's place for a moment. Imagine spending years making yourself useful because being needed felt safer than hoping someone might simply choose you. Then imagine finding the courage to ask the question she had avoided most of her life. Would you still want me if I had nothing to give? Jacob's answer mattered because he had learned something too. A strong man can build fences, raise cattle, protect children, and keep a roof standing through a Montana winter. But love asks for another kind of courage. The courage to let somebody matter enough that losing them would hurt. Grace didn't heal Jacob by feeding him. Jacob didn't rescue Grace by giving her a home. They gave each other something quieter, a second chance to stop living from old wounds. And sometimes family begins exactly there, not with blood or obligation, but with someone reaching beneath the table for your hand and trusting that you'll leave it there. If this story touched something in you, tell me in the comments. What do you think Grace and Jacob taught each other? And if you'd like to stay a while, subscribe. There are more stories of love, mystery, healing, and second chances waiting down the trail.